You're listening to AncientFaithRadio.com.
He will be a staff for the righteous with which for them to stand and not to fall. And he will be the light of the nations and the hope of those whose hearts are troubled. All who dwell on the earth will fall down and worship him, and they will praise and bless and celebrate with song the Lord of spirits. 1 Enoch chapter 48, verses 4 through 5. The modern world doesn't acknowledge, but is nevertheless haunted by spirits, angels, demons, and saints. In our time, many yearn to break free of the prison of a flat, secular materialism, to see and to know reality as it truly is. What is this spiritual reality like? How do we engage with it well? How do we permeate everyday life with spiritual presence? Orthodox Christian priests, Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung, host this live call-in show focused on enchantment in creation, the union of the seen and unseen as made by God and experienced by mankind throughout history. Welcome to the Lord of Spirits.
Good evening, giant killers, dragon slayers. Christ is risen. He truly is risen. You are listening to the Lord of Spirits podcast. My co-host, the very Reverend Dr. Stephen James DeYoung, is with me from Lafayette,
Esquire.
Louisiana.
Oh, wait, not yet. Not yet. That's next. That's once I run out of PhDs to get. I'm going to
That's true.
do law school just to keep
Double
the student loans
doctor,
in abeyance.
Postgraduate,
Yeah.
postdoctoral.
Yeah, get that
Yeah.
Esquire there.
Master doctor. I don't know. Is there something above? Well, anyway. Right. And I'm Father Andrew Stephen Damick in Emmaus, Pennsylvania. If you're listening to us live, and I hope you are, you can call in at 855 AF Radio. That's 855-237-2346. And Matushka Trudy is going to actually have to work tonight. She's going to be taking your calls. That's what she's going to be doing all night long. Just your calls. Because it's an all live, all Q&A show. We haven't had one of these since our second anniversary show last September when we played that clip about leprechauns. Good times. So, listeners, dear listeners, I'm going to make you a deal. There's two options we can do tonight. Option number one is that you can call, and we'll keep answering your messages, your questions. Or I can instead read from the fragment of the version of the Passion of St. Christopher, which is found in the Beowulf manuscript in Old English, and Father Stephen can offer commentary. So what will it be? Will it be your calls? Or will it be Minnes drichtes hallendes Christus actuertisi an unsnotor? I love that word, unsnotor. It means unwise, but it looks like unsnotty. But it's unwise.
There's a flaw in your plan here.
Oh, is
There's
there?
a certain segment of our audience that would probably like to hear that.
It's true. I mean, it literally was St. Christopher's Day just 2 days ago. So like this is, like all the symbolic world people, this is their week-long festival or whatever, right? They're all wearing their dog-headed masks and stuff. And there's a handful of people that would love to hear it in Old English.
You should have threatened them with like Proust. That would have been the way to go.
I have some other, yeah, or, I could read like Derrida or,
Yeah. So here's before we get any listener questions, assuming they're lining up.
They are lining up, actually. They don't
Okay.
want to hear me read from the Passion of St. Christopher in Old English.
I have a question for you, sir.
Oh boy.
So, given, right, so sort of my A and B statements for my syllogism are: A, Father Andrew loves musical theater.
It's
B,
basically true.
B, Father Andrew hates rap.
That's basically also true.
So, what happened with Hamilton for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's pretty easy to solve that because from my point of view, and don't at me, bros and sizzes, rap isn't music. So I know they call it a musical, but just putting that out there.
So, okay. So the B statement, was right. Rap music is for you an oxymoron.
Yeah, correct.
That is where you would break that.
That's right. I mean,
That
and I
paradox,
say this
the Hamilton
knowing that
paradox.
every time I say this, it breaks the heart of Jamie Bennett, but he has a very big, soft heart, so he can handle it. So,
well, the whole last episode was secretly, I'm going to let people in behind the scenes, behind the curtain. The last episode about the soul of Lord of Spirits was actually secretly a project by me to see how many Public Enemy sub-references I could get into a single episode of Lord of Spirits.
I know.
So, and there were a lot of them. So now everyone can go back and re-listen just for the Easter eggs.
Martyric existence in doing this show.
So what Father Andrew has taken away, hip-hop heads, I return to you.
All right. Well, we do have a bunch of people lined up. In fact, it is a full call board. So other people calling right now probably can't even get through. But first we have Paul from Texas. Paul, are you the same Paul we talked to last time?
I am indeed, Father.
You made it again. You got through.
I've been a real go-getter about this.
Are you wearing a cowboy hat this time?
I am not. I apologize.
Okay. Do you remember the Alamo?
I do, always.
Okay.
Are the stars bright late at night?
They are. Not in the city, tragically, but elsewhere.
Yeah.
I learned that song from Pee-wee's Big Adventure. Just kidding. Just kidding. It does feature in that film, though.
Yes, prominently.
That's right. So, all right. Well, welcome back, Paul, to the Lord of Spirits podcast. What is your question?
Well, first, please let me clear my name and apologize to all of our Oriental Orthodox friends. I am so sorry. I have since learned that the proper way to refer to this distinction is either Chalcedonian or non-Chalcedonian.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I did not have that before.
Well, over time, these terms have evolved, and I mean, like non-Chalcedonian can also refer to the Assyrian Church of the East, aka the Nestorians, because they're also not Chalcedonians. But yes, I mean, so Oriental Orthodox is the kind of general term in English that you usually hear these days to refer to those particular churches. So. Yes.
Well, I just wanted to put out an apology to everyone that I may have upset.
Yes.
Okay. They added him, I think.
Yeah.
That mob out there who's beating down Paul's door, you can back off. It's okay.
Break through the window.
He's gotten his repentance on.
Okay, so I had to super condense this, so I hope I have still managed to make sense of it. So we understand that the cosmos has a proper order and that it's been violated when sin was introduced, setting aside the fallen angels. When man fell, at least, the cosmos got set out of order. God must restore it, just like God does not lie. He does not go against himself, and he wants it to be what it's supposed to be. And justice, properly understood, is the restoration of that proper order. Now, justice, when it's meted out, begets a kind of consequence, because there's going to be some aspect of restoring it to proper order that occurs that is often negative. And it seems that that's just a necessary aspect of it. Would I be, if correct me at any point along this road if I'm wrong, but if it seems to me that God's wrath is really the feltly negative consequence of that justice, of that putting things from out of order back into their proper order. And so, since sin brought everything out of order and Christ's sacrifice for us, it seems as though he bears the kind of painful consequence of that. Not entirely. We still have our own consequences. We still pass through fire in the end, whether we're saved or not. But it seems like he bore the brunt of the negative consequence, and that in doing so, justly, appropriately, the Father makes him judge. And it goes from there to whether he forgives or does not forgive, depending upon his mercies and our repentance. Now, what my issue is that, and part of this is probably coming from the Protestant, origins that I had as a Christian, but I hear a lot of negativity about the penal substitution theory and, about the way Protestants view the theories of atonement and all that. And I agree with a large part of that. I think that the critiques are very valid. But it also seems to me that what I just loosely described also fits the penal substitutionary theory of atonement, that Christ did bear the wrath of God, that he did suffer for our sake and kind of take the punishment for our sins in order to save us from it. I have trouble understanding how, if we can just leave aside the kind of connotatively negative view that the penal substitution provides us of God, you know, with his fists balled and shaking and stomping his feet and angry and having to hurt something to feel better, that if we could just leave that aside and kind of look past and through the specific legal terms, that does still describe the process of things being out of order, justice having to be restored or mitigated for things to be restored, there being a negative aspect of that, and Christ taking that for us if we would just partake in his life and then being restored. My question is, in what way does the penal substitution not align with that? If we set aside the negative view of God we tend to think of with it.
Okay. I think I followed you most of the way there. It was a long series of semicolons, I think.
Right.
Sorry.
I tried to condense a lot.
It was like a Greek sentence.
Yes, right. Like it was exactly like it was like this. He's like his name saint here, like St. Paul. Okay, so here's the couple of things that I would say about what you said. So the God's justice, right, is experienced. The term wrath is the experience of God's justice by being put right when you're wrong, right? Mm-hmm. And so the idea then that Christ is experiencing that doesn't make sense, because he's not wrong in any way, right? But he does experience the consequences of sin, right? And that's the term where it says he became a curse for us, because the curse that's in creation is the consequences of, it's the damage that's done by human sin. And, if you recall from Genesis, where God comes to Abraham and they make the covenant, and he has Abraham cut those animals in half, right? And it makes this sort of path in between them. This is based on this idea that, when this covenant is made, that the person walking in between the parts, it's essentially saying, like, if I break this covenant, then these are the consequences I'm going to suffer. I'm going to be like these split animals if I break the covenant, right? But what happens when God makes the covenant with Abraham is that he doesn't have Abraham, who is sort of the vassal in this arrangement. He himself walks through it in the form of this burning torch to say that he's going to take upon himself the consequences of the covenant being broken. And so Christ's suffering on the cross is that he's receiving the damage that's happening. It's not that God is saying, well, I got to whoop somebody and it's going to better him than anybody else, so Christ is not being put right, because he is righteousness himself. But rather he's suffering the consequences of our sins, because of the way that we put the world out of whack and the damage that's done and all that kind of stuff. That would be the way that I would respond to what you said. I don't know, Father, what do you got?
I would nuance what Father Andrew just said a little bit, but I'm not going to focus on that. I think the problem with anything approaching penal substitutionary atonement, there's a bunch of them. And this applies to what you laid out too. One of the biggest ones is a Trinitarian problem. What does it mean to say that Christ experienced his own wrath?
That was not rhetorical. Okay.
No, I mean, I'm not. It can be rhetorical. I'm not trying to put you on the spot, right?
Paul. Answer.
Because Christ is God, and one of the ways in which this is original Trinitarianism, right, is that the persons of the Holy Trinity, the hypostases, share one energy, one activity, right? So you can't have the Father's being wrathful at the Son. Right? The wrath of God is would be the wrath shared by all three persons. Right? So you would have to have the Son suffering his own wrath. You would have to, like a certain three initial person on the West Coast, separate like the human body of Christ from the divine Son, right? This creates Christological problems, Trinitarian problems, right? That's the biggest issue there. But it also, the other big issue, or another big issue, is any kind of penal substitution only works if you're a Calvinist or a Universalist. Or you're Karl Barth and you say, "Porque no los dos," right? Because
Karl Barth.
Right, because otherwise you have he would have said it in German, but you have God punishing sins twice otherwise. Because if Christ bears the consequences instead of me, but other person, and we're assuming here for the sake of argument that I am saved, right, in the end, and another person is going to suffer those consequences of his sin himself in the end, then that would mean that when Christ died, he suffered for my sins and not that other person's. So for Calvinists, that's easy, right? They say, yeah, Christ died for the sins of the elect, and that's it, right? Limited atonement. Or if you're a Universalist, you could just say, yeah, he died for everybody's, right? So nobody goes to hell, right? Nobody suffers God's wrath, right? Everyone is set free from it. But aside from those two options, you get into this really weird, sticky territory of, well, you know, you could take like a classical Arminian approach and say, well, God looked down the corridors of time and saw who would, of their own free will, get saved, and then Christ died for those people's sins because he knew who they would be. But now you've got God inside time and looking into the future, which is weird. And when Calvinists say the only consistent way to be an Arminian is to be an open theist, they're kind of right. So there come to be a lot of issues there. And then the last issue I would point to is that one of the most common sops that I see given by Orthodox folks to some kind of substitutionary atonement, like they'll say, oh, we believe in substitutionary atonement but not penal substitution. It's like, well, okay, you know, you're trying to, you know, be ecumenical in a good way. And be, you know, irenic, which I should probably do more of, but it's probably a pipe dream. I don't think I will. The problem is the way they usually describe that is they say, well, see, we deserve to die and Christ died so we don't have to. But last I checked, I'm still going to die. So then you have to say, well, wait, are you talking about physical death or spiritual death? Because if you're talking about physical death, yes, Christ died a physical death, but I will too, right? Mm-hmm. And if you're talking about spiritual death, then go back to all of our Trinity problems, because spiritual death is being separated from God, right? Yeah.
Christ does not die a spiritual death.
Yeah. So even that, I mean, I get why people want to do it, to try to be ironic. It doesn't really work. So I think it's better, rather than trying to say, hey, isn't there some way that we can accept this, to just say, hey, you know what? We have better models, understandings that accord better with what Scripture teaches, and just sort of positively teach those instead.
There you go, Paul.
I definitely, I think I track. I'm pretty sure I do. I'll have to go back and listen again, I'm sure, but well,
alrighty.
Thank you very much, Fathers. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you, sir. Wear another disguise if you call back in.
No promises.
Okay. Well, we next have John calling from Michigan. John, welcome to the Lord of Spirits podcast.
Hi, Fathers. Thanks for having me.
We had Paul and John. Let's see if we can get all 12 apostles by the end of the episode.
Or just a George and a Ringo.
Yeah.
Oh, there you go. That's awesome. So I've been a long time listener, and so I guess this question kind of encompasses a number of different episodes, maybe related to, I guess, the soul and the body, and particularly what needs to be made in the image of God. One thing you said a while back really struck me, where St. Constantine banned branding on the face because that was the image of Christ on all of us. And so what that kind of got some wheels turning, I guess. And so I was thinking about just what it means to be made in the image of God. I think usually people think about that in terms of the soul, the intellectual soul. But then, I mean, not to go off on a tangent, but I think there is a lot of arguments that could be made about how our physical anatomy is at least reflective of our intellectual soul. So anyway, but then to kind of circle back to something else you talked about, which with iconography of God and Adam in the garden, right? God is obviously depicted as Christ, right? As the way Christ looked at the incarnation. So anyway, I guess all this kind of leads up to my question being something along the lines of, normally I would have thought that Christ, the incarnate Christ, looks like we do because that's just what humans happen to look like, right? But now I started wondering, what if it's the other way around, right? What if humans, quote unquote, happen to look the way we do because in some way you could say that that's what God looks like? And obviously in some way is a big qualifier there. But anyway, I was wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways I've heard this talked about is, in the Septuagint version of Genesis, where it says that, that man is made in God's image. The word that's used there, and I don't know if this is true, I'm not a Greek scholar, so, throw me under the bus if you have to, Father Stephen, it's great. Is the word that's used there in the Greek is kata, so like according to, or along the lines of, so let us make man according to our image. And the way that I've read that parsed on some occasions is, well, who is the image of God? Well, Christ is the image of God. And so the idea then that Christ is in some way the template for humanity. So it's not that humanity looks like a God kind of in general, but that humanity is based on Christ in particular, right? And so you get a kind of a whole chicken and egg theological issue there, but
right.
But I mean, I feel like it works. Which, I mean, yes, you don't want to start theological comments with the phrase "I feel," but but hey, it's just a podcast, people. You could just say stuff. Yeah, I mean that makes sense to me because like the incarnation, this mystery that we don't understand that becomes manifest to us at a particular point in time, is still transhistorical. And that's why we depict Christ walking in the garden. That's why we depict Christ, in all kinds of situations in the Old Testament. Okay. It's not anachronistic.
Okay.
It's beyond Chronos,
That part's really cool. Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. So that's my way of kind of parsing it out. When people ask me about that stuff, that's generally what I say. So I don't know. Throw me under the bus, Father Stephen. Let me have it.
No, I don't have to on this one.
Oh, great.
I'm sure the night's young, but
that's true. We still got a long ways to go.
This is so the real LOS old heads may remember way back in the long ago time, back when my power was going out, and I was huddled somewhere trying to reconnect.
Were you there for that, John? Did you listen to that period?
I definitely did. Yeah.
So
you've been with us.
we talked about how the texts that are usually discussed in Scripture, they're talking about God and presenting him as having a human body. that's usually described as an anthropomorphism, right? These are anthropomorphisms. They're presenting God as if he were a human, and that the reality is actually the opposite in terms of what the scriptures teach, that humanity is theomorphic. And just to take this to the next level of brain breaking, because, hey, why not, right? There is an interesting discussion that goes on in the Fathers about when human nature was created, not when the first Adam was created, but when human nature was created. And most of the answers say Christ did it. Some of them at the incarnation, Christ created human nature.
Whoa.
Some of them on the cross.
What?
Yes.
Wait, are you saying that the wibbly wobbly timey wimey stuff is not something we're just making up here in the
No, it's not. And the rabbit hole goes deeper than that.
Yeah.
So and someone who has cataloged a lot of the latter case of Christ creating humanity on the cross, for another unrelated reason, but someone who's cataloged a lot of those is Father John Bear. He was working on different issues when he did it, but he's cataloged a bunch of the church fathers speaking in that way.
Awesome. Wow. Well, that's I was not expecting an answer like that. That was amazing. Thank you.
I was going to say, are you okay there, John? There was this little pause.
Yeah. No, I'm just trying to take it all in, but no, that was awesome.
Me
Really
too,
appreciate
bro.
it.
Me too. All right. Well, thank you very much. Where are you, by the way, I'm just out of curiosity, where in Michigan are you? I have some familiarity with that hand-shaped state.
Oh, right on. Yeah, I'm in the Lansing area. I'm actually in Hillsdale in particular.
Do you go to that school? Do you go to Hillsdale College?
No, I just live in the town here.
Oh, all right. Well, very good. All right. Well, thank you very much for calling, John. Next, we have Emilian calling. Emilian, welcome to the Lord of Spirits podcast.
Thank you, Fathers. Do you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
All right. Christ is risen.
He truly is risen.
Okay. So if there is no problem, I actually have two questions.
Sure, that's no problem.
The first one, and I'm glad that you brought up the idea of the covenant. I would like to disambiguate several things regarding the covenant and the law. So actually in Romanian there is a problem because all these things that I'm going to talk about are translated as law. And you might get easily confused because of that. So I understood what a covenant is and this idea of cutting a covenant, and I find it fascinating. And I want to know that 10 Commandments are sort of the central part of the law of God, of the Torah, because the people of Israel also received commandments apart from them. So we have several instances in the book of Exodus, for example, in Exodus chapter 24, before the people are sprinkled with the blood of the covenant, we are told that Moses wrote God's commandments in the book of the covenant. And then in Deuteronomy, we have what is called the scroll of the law, which seems to be the same thing. And this Moses commands the Levites to place at the foot, I think, of the Ark of the Covenant. And I think this is the same book that the kings are required to copy for themselves, to make a copy for themselves. So I would like to know which one, if any of these is the Torah, and if any of these is the book of Deuteronomy, as I have heard before. So what do you think?
I mean, my understanding is that the Torah is the first 5 books of the scriptures: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. I almost forgot for a second there. And it's all of it together. It's not any one subset of commandments, right? Isn't that right, Father Stephen?
Well, yeah. So, yeah, there's a bunch of interesting things going on here. Yeah. So the 10 Commandments, which is really more like the 10 words, that's where we get Decalogue, right? That appears in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, gets repeated there, is sort of a microcosm of the commandments as a whole. And the way that's expressed is that the typical covenant format that was used for a bereat, right, for the kind of covenant that we're talking about, had a certain format. It begins with introducing the suzerain, the ruler, the high king, right? Introduces himself, says what he's done, what his accomplishments are. It then lays out the duties and responsibilities of the vassal, and then has the consequences for obedience and disobedience. And so you see that format in the 10 Commandments, right? It starts out, I am Yahweh your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, who he is, what he's just done for them. And then he gives the commandments, here's your responsibilities, right? And included in that in several places are those blessings and curses, like honor your father and your mother so that your days may be long in the land the Lord is giving you. One of the reasons why Deuteronomy is sometimes treated as a separate unit, textual reasons, not weird academic reasons, but textual reasons why Deuteronomy is treated as an independent entity, is that the whole book of Deuteronomy follows that same format, including ending with the blessings and curses in chapters 28 through 30. So you have sort of the 10 Commandments presented as a summary of the whole thing. You then have the whole thing, and then you have Devteros Nomos, right? Deuteronomy, the second law, the second Torah, right? Where it's sort of all reiterated again as one unit by Moses and sort of his parting sermon to the people of Israel. So it gets restated in various lengths and various abbreviations repeatedly within the Torah, which is the 5 books. Right? So in terms of what was put in the Ark of the Covenant, usually people read the tablets and think, in fact, people will even teach the 10 Commandments this way, that like the first 4 were on one tablet and then the other 6 were on the other tablet. Like God ran out of space or something on the first one. But in actuality, it's 2 copies of the same thing. We know this from the way covenants of that type were ratified at that time in history. And so normally, when a high king would give a covenant to a vassal, one copy of that covenant would be kept by the king so that he could consult it and know his responsibilities. And the other copy would be taken to the temple of a god and put at the feet of the idol, because that was seen as calling on that god to bear witness to that agreement, right? If it should happen that it would be broken in the future. So in the case of the covenant at Mount Sinai, both copies are taken and are placed in the Ark of the Covenant, because that is the footstool of the throne of God. So it's at the feet of God. There's no idol, right? But it's at the feet of Yahweh, the God of Israel. And the second copy is held by the king, which is Yahweh, the God of Israel. Okay. Then that gets in Deuteronomy, as you mentioned, that gets slightly adapted. Once there is going to be a human king in Israel who is going to be an icon of God and his kingship, he is then to make a copy of that, right? He is to make a copy of that. And so the reason why you've heard that that was just the book of Deuteronomy is that critical scholarship, our 18th and 19th century German friends, of course, believe nothing even remotely vaguely looking anything like any part of the Torah was around when Moses was around, if he even existed, from their point of view. And everything was written much later. And so they take the story of Josiah recovering the book of the law, King Josiah, who's a saint in the Orthodox Church. The story of him recovering the book of the law, which had been lost, not meaning they didn't know where it was, just meaning nobody was paying any attention to it. The wicked kings before him were ignoring it and didn't care about it. When he recovers it, they reinterpreted that story as, oh no, Josiah made it up. And that version that Josiah made up is the book of Deuteronomy. So that's based on that kind of weird critical theory. Now, the actual evidence, the actual concrete evidence for that doesn't exist. There isn't any, right? But that's their hypothetical reconstruction. So it seems pretty clear, right? Because the commandment to make a copy is to make a copy of the Torah. That's what it literally says in the Hebrew, right? That commandment is in Deuteronomy. So if it was just talking about Deuteronomy, it would have said, make a copy of this book. Right? But it says to make a copy of the Torah. Right? The whole unit. And again, there is zero concrete evidence that the 5 books of the Torah ever circulated separately. The only thing anybody has to pin Deuteronomy being a separate thing on is the fact that it has its own internal structure. But that doesn't mean that it's unrelated. Just the fact that it has a certain structure. Genesis also has a certain structure that's different than the structure of the other 4 books. Genesis is framed around this phrase, this is the book of the generations, Eila Toledot in Hebrew. Right, and the other 4 books of the Torah don't use that as a framing device. That doesn't mean it's unrelated. That just means it's structured a little differently because the contents are a little different. Right. So I hope that gets at what you were asking in terms of what's what with that.
Does that make sense, Emilian?
Yes, it does help.
Okay, good. You said you had a second question.
Yes, this one is a bit weirder, but maybe you can answer it. So it has to do with an older video of Jonathan Pajot, where he talked about the existence of Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. So basically, he said that Santa exists because we talk about him because people dress up like him, and there are stories, there are movies, songs, decorations, and all these things about him. So we know what he does and what his role is. So he said that, for example, the people who dress up like him and act like Santa in a mall, for example, talking to kids, these people are parts or extensions of his being or of his body. And I thought about this idea of body as an axis of powers, and I'm curious if basically these people are his powers, let's say, as powers.
Yeah, so I mean, I've watched that video. I can't answer for Jonathan Pajot, but my understanding of what he's trying to do with that is essentially to make a phenomenological argument, that people are experiencing this phenomenon called Santa Claus, and they're experiencing it through people, a guy in a mall, or whatever else, right? Or they're experiencing it through someone answering their mail, or they're experiencing it through presents that show up under the Christmas tree that are said to be from Santa Claus, right? And, that's a real experience, and people do group that together as being an experience. Now, certainly, there's different ways in which people experience that. A kid who's been told there is this man who's going to show up at our house in the middle of the night and come through the chimney and leave presents is experiencing it differently than the dad who is reluctantly bringing his kids to see the mall Santa because they asked for that, But nonetheless, there is this common experience that people are having, right? And then to say, well, he doesn't exist is essentially to say that there is no experience. But that's not true. There clearly is an experience. That's my understanding of what the argument that Jonathan Pajot is making. I mean, honestly, I'm much more comfortable just talking about St. Nicholas of Myra, who, exists in all the ways that are much easier to talk about. But it may be that on some level, the love and the kindness of the saint is in some way being participated in through this other phenomenon.
Yes.
I'm not going to go so far as to say that Mall Santa is part of the body of St. Nicholas the Wonder Worker. I don't know that I would say that.
My question is actually about Star Wars. So,
about Star Wars?
Kind of Star Wars, yes. And you've referenced it several times during this show, and it really pained me that Father Stephen said that the canon in Star Wars doesn't really matter because it's fictional. But I thought it all happened a long time ago in a galaxy far away. But the idea is that if we can have this phenomenological experience of Santa Claus, for example, can't we say the same thing, for example, about Luke Skywalker? Because there are stories about him, people, cosplayers impersonate him, you can talk to him basically. So what exactly is the difference? Is it the fact that Santa is based on Saint Nicholas and the other one isn't based on anyone? What is the difference between a fictional character who is impersonated by someone and something like Santa Claus?
That's an interesting question. Well, Father Stephen, since you said that canon doesn't matter in the Star Wars universe, I'm going to let you go first on that.
That may have been a cope, given most of the Star Wars movies I've seen recently, to say that canon doesn't matter. I'm still pretending there's only 3 movies.
I'm still recovering from certain episodes of the most recent season of The Mandalorian.
Yeah. So that may have been a cope on my part. Yeah. So I've never spoken to Jonathan Pajot about this directly. I have the impression, to be honest, this almost came up at one point in an episode. I have the impression that this is a place where I disagree with him, which may or may not be true, because like I said, I haven't talked about it with him, right? So like I watch a video of his, I say what I think about it, and that's sort of 2 halves of a conversation, but it's not an actual conversation, right? And I think it's because if I'm correct in my read of what he's saying, right? It seems to me that he is treating, for example, Santa Claus as a spirit,
right?
As opposed to a concept. And the difference between a concept and a spirit, the way I'm using it, is that a spirit has agency and a concept doesn't. And so I think that distinction is where potentially he and I disagree, because I don't think that a concept like Santa Claus or Luke Skywalker or Captain James Tiberius Kirk, as opposed to the person of William Shatner, the greatest man alive. Right. I think they exist as concept, but I don't think they have any agency. I don't think they can act. I don't think they can produce effects.
Yeah.
They exist as ideas. So I would agree that Santa Claus exists, but I have the impression, and again, I could be reading this wrong. I'd have to talk to him about it directly. Or, hey, Jonathan, if you're listening right now live, call in. But that I think would be the distinction for me. So yes, I would say Luke Skywalker exists as a concept, but I don't think the concept Luke Skywalker has agency to affect things in the actual world. I think the concept of Santa Claus or Luke Skywalker, I think what a concept does is a concept is used instrumentally by people. So the agent would be me. And I would take the concept of Luke Skywalker or the concept of Santa Claus and I would use that instrumentally to produce certain effects. Right? So I would dress up like Santa, right, in order to use that persona as an instrument to accomplish certain things in the world. But I would not be embodying an existent spirit of Santa Claus and having that spirit operate through me. That's the distinction I at least potentially see here, because I don't think it's now Saint Nicholas is right a spirit, right? So that's a different case. So Santa Claus may not be the best example because of that connection. But if I go and cosplay as Obi-Wan Kenobi, right? Like, I don't think an existent spirit Obi-Wan Kenobi is going to be acting through me. I think I'm going to be dressed as Obi-Wan Kenobi in order to accomplish certain things, to use that persona in a certain way within a certain social setting. So yeah, that's I think a difference.
So I'll add two things. Number one, I would like to see you dress up as Santa Claus. Number two, and perhaps more importantly,
my beard's getting pretty white. I could pull it off.
Yeah. And you know, a little talcum powder or whatever can make up for the rest. But I, you know, to address the question of, so I'm tracking with what you said, Father Stephen. I agree with everything you just said. But so within that frame, then I think there is a difference between people dressing up as Santa Claus and the whole matrix of that concept versus, you know, going down to, I can't remember which, you know, amusement park in Florida where you can meet Star Wars characters, right? And that. The way that people participate in Star Wars is very different than the way that people participate in the Santa Claus side of things for Christmas. Or if you're Dutch, it's December, you know, the presents are on December 6th, as I know.
On St. Nicholas Day. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Clearly St.
Exactly.
Nicholas. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, because it's a much deeper cultural experience that's going on with Santa Claus. And there's a lot of investment in the idea that we should at least tell young kids that there is this spirit, there is this person coming into our house to do this thing. Whereas no one says that to their kids about Luke Skywalker or whatever. Now they might, you know, be at the amusement park and say, "Oh, look, kids, it's Luke Skywalker. You know, that was so great. You got to meet Luke Skywalker," right? But that'll last for 5 minutes. That's very different than the participation that happens with Santa Claus. So, and I think the difference is of degree in this case. It's much deeper and richer with Santa Claus. There's a lot more going on there. But
part of that's time too.
Yeah, exactly. There's been a lot more time, you know, to do that.
But yep. Even when you look at it, when Santa Claus, as we have him now, first shows up in the Condé Nast stuff, it's very clear he was being instrumentalized in a certain way.
Yeah.
For example, at first, the reason saying Santa Claus brought the presents was to keep kids from begging their parents for stuff.
Right. Yes.
And to kind of it was kind of a offense against sort of the open materialism that has now overtaken Christmas. that was like, oh no, this is this third party, right, is intervening here. So write him a letter, but who knows? We'll see.
Exactly. Yeah, I much prefer. I don't know if anyone's out there is a fan of a certain British author. He wrote a book called Letters from Father Christmas, which he wrote for his kids.
Why are you misgendering J.K. Rowling?
I'm not.
Anyway, I was just being ironic. Never mind. Forget that.
Thank you. Yeah. That's good, though. I like that subtweeting on your part. Yeah, so Tolkien has this book, Letters from Father Christmas, that's the whole conceit of it, is that Father Christmas is sending letters to Tolkien's kids, and he's telling stories, and it's really, really fun, actually. I highly, highly recommend it. So, I don't know. Emilian, does that answer your queries?
Yes, it does.
All right. Well, thank you very much for calling in, and Christos Anviat.
Adevărat Anviat.
All right. Well, we are going to go ahead and take our first break with this half of the Lord of Spirits, and we'll be right back with more of your calls.
Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung will be back in a moment to take your calls on the next part of the Lord of Spirits. Give them a call at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Hi, do you know me? I'm Father Stephen DeYoung. My new book, Apocrypha, An Introduction to Extra-Biblical Literature, is now available. A lot of Christians today divide ancient Jewish and Christian literature into two categories: what's in the Bible, what's not in the Bible. Christian East, however, has traditionally had a third category, a middle category: books that are read privately in the home. The Greek word for that is Apocrypha. These texts from the centuries before and the centuries after the incarnation of Christ, that go beyond even the larger canons of Orthodox and Roman Catholic churches, reveal to us the religious world and theological framework of the apostles and early church fathers. In this book, Apocrypha, I survey these works, which connect elements of liturgy, scripture, iconography, patristic writings. Familiarity with these works will enhance readers' understanding of the breadth and depth of the Orthodox Christian faith. Buy your copy of Apocrypha, An Introduction to Extra-Biblical Literature at store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back now with the Lord of Spirits, with Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung. If you have a question, call now at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. We got a question from somebody on the Facebooks asking, are the call lines not working because they keep getting a voicemail message? And the truth is if you get that message, that means that the lines are full. What you should do is keep calling. Don't leave a message. Yeah. Don't leave a voicemail. We won't get it. Just keep calling. So
because if you want to win those monster truck tickets for Saturday night, you have to be the 1027th caller.
That's true. And if you don't call, I have in front of me a copy of The Shape of the Liturgy by Dom Gregory Dix, which I can read to for everybody tonight. So, it's a hard to find book. It might be worth it. So, anyway, what we do have a caller.
Are we going to leave me doing Troy McClure on that commercial just unsaid? I'm just going to pass over that in silence.
Nice. I'm TV's Troy McClure. All right. Well, we've got Michael on the line. Michael, who's right here in the Keystone State. So, Michael, welcome to the Lord of Spirits podcast.
Thank you. Christ is risen.
He truly is risen.
Oh, good. It's not the Michael I thought it was. I was going to be. Jeez.
Wow.
Podcast people are going to go crazy.
Which Michael are you?
Thank you for being a different Michael, sir.
You're welcome.
So what's on your mind, Michael?
Yeah, so I had a question, the Old Testament passage, 4 Kings chapter 3. So here's my question. In 4 Kings chapter 3, we read of an alliance of kings. They began their invasion of Moab after prophet Elijah prophesied, quote, "Ye shall smite every fenced city," end quote. Everything is going according to Elijah's prophecy until the armies reach the last city. in which the king of Moab burns his own son alive on the wall as an offering in a desperate attempt to entreat the god of Moab for victory. So in the last verse it says a great indignity, or in some translations it says wrath, came over the armies of Israel and they retreated. It almost seems like the Moabite king burning his son alive on the wall as an offering for victory actually worked. The Moabite stone uncovered in 1868 seems to suggest that this is a celebration of the king of Moab's victory over the people of Israel. Saint from the Syrian said that God may have actually taken pity on the king of Moab. He even goes as far as to say that this sacrifice may have even been received by the God of Abraham. So my question is, was Elisha's prophecy overturned? Was Yahweh really defeated in battle? How are we supposed to understand this passage?
I'm going to just kick this right to you, Father Stephen.
Sort of. No, I'll explain. So this is one of those places where we have to remember that prophecies are not predictions of the future. Right? Prophetic utterances are speaking for God. So, for example, the book of Jonah. Jonah, when he goes to Nineveh, there's no if, there's no conditional statement. It's God's going to destroy this city in a few days. That's it. No, if you don't repent, no nothing, right? He just announces this is going to happen. And then, of course, they repent and it doesn't happen. And then Jonah says, man, I knew this was going to happen if I came here, right? He says, I knew I was going to come and announce this. And then you weren't going to follow through because they were going to repent. And, you know, you'd accept their repent, right? So in terms of Elijah's prophecy, right, all of these are contingent. All such prophecies and promises are contingent on obedience, right? And all sort of oracles of doom are dependent on a lack of repentance, right? So otherwise there would be no point in announcing it in advance, right? So it's announced in advance to say, okay, the soldiers of Israel going into battle should, right, put their trust in God, that God is going to give them the victory, right? And so what happens, the verb there that gets variously translated, right, as whatever overtook, right, the Israelite armies after the sacrifice, this public display. It's passive. It's something that happened to them, right, without God being described as the agent. And then they take the action, the verbal action of retreating, right? So what's being presented is that they were supposed to put their trust in Yahweh, the God of Israel, who has said, you will have victory. That doesn't mean they didn't have to go fight, right? That didn't mean they didn't have to go fight the battle, right? That meant they were supposed to stay in the battle no matter how bad the battle looked, no matter how bad things got. They were to be faithful. They were to put their trust in God to give them the victory, right? But when they saw the king take this extreme action, which culturally, right, is, I mean, obviously is an extreme action, but this is sort of the ultimate thing, because it's the king's son. It's the heir to the throne, right? This is sort of the ultimate thing you could do to get your God, in this case, Chemosh, right, on their side. The Israelites then were filled with fear and retreated. So they showed faithlessness, right? They did not trust God to give them the victory. They thought, oh no, we're in trouble now, right? Chemosh is going to come get us, right? They've got their God on their side. And so they retreated, and so they failed and they lost, and a lot of people died, right? Because they didn't put their trust in God and in the words of his prophet.
So they could have won, but they chose not to.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, if you
If they
read,
remained faithful and kept fighting, God would have given them the victory, but they didn't.
yeah, and if you read what Elisha says, he says, "You shall attack every fortified city and every choice city, and shall fell every good tree and stop up all the springs of water and ruin every good piece of land with stones." Where does it says, "Put the Moabites in your hand"? Yeah. This is a light thing in the light side of the Lord. He will also give the Moabites into your hand, and then he goes on and says, "You got to attack everybody and do all this stuff." But yeah, it doesn't mean, as Father said, it doesn't say you will be victorious no matter what. Right? It doesn't say that. So.
Yeah. The reason I ask is a while back I heard a very interesting take on this, that because a lot of people believe in a lot of different gods even today. I know you both know that. And some are using this passage as a proof text that Yahweh is not the supreme God and that he can be defeated. And I'm wondering what your response would be to that.
I would say read the rest of the book.
Yeah, the text doesn't say that.
Yeah.
Right.
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 Yeah.
That's the ultimate response, because everything is framed. That's part of the purpose of what's going on in 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, or 1st through 4th Kingdoms. Right. Part of the theme there is that all of the good things that happened to Israel are because they were faithful to Yahweh, and all the bad things that happened to Israel are because they were faithless to Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
And that it is not. I mean, the theme is the exact opposite of that, right? Because the whole purpose of writing these books at the time of the exile of Judah was to say, hey, don't mistake this to think that Marduk beat Yahweh, and that's why you're going into exile in Babylon. You're going into exile in Babylon because Yahweh is sending you there.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that reading of that story is pulling it out of context and reading it in the exact opposite way that those of the themes of those books. But this is also a good see the point that people leave out there. See, that any pagan who uses this is secretly a Calvinist.
Right.
Right? Because they see human events as being the product of divine puppet masters.
Yeah.
Right? Who are the only ones acting. They're monergists, right?
Mm-hmm.
And whereas this text is a prime example of synergism, right? Yes, God makes promises to us and gives us his grace and he acts in the world, but we have to cooperate with that. God coming and saying, I'm going to give you the victory in battle doesn't mean we're just going to show up and the army will all be dead already. Right? And we can just take their stuff.
Yeah,
right?
I suppose there's a pagan view of faith, which is this is what's going to happen and there's nothing you can do to change it.
Right.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. All right. Does that answer your question, Michael?
Yes, it does. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you very much for calling. Next, we have
That was going to be a bunch of really angry Calvinists because they're going to say I just called them pagans. And I did not just say Calvinists are pagans. I said that American neo-pagans are Calvinists.
There we go. Let's make everybody.
Yeah. Just
Okay,
so we're clear on what I said. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like this time I'm aiming my barbs in this direction.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got Eugene calling from Minnesota. Eugene, welcome to the Lord of Spirits podcast.
Thank you.
I think I know who this is because I don't think there are that many Eugenes in Minnesota
I know.
listening to
There's
this.
not a lot of Eugenes.
I could be wrong.
Actually, I am Eugene the Third. So, and my son's name is Eugene as well. So there's at least 4.
Okay.
Yeah.
All in Minnesota?
Yeah. Well, actually, one of them in Colorado. So no.
What's wrong with that one?
That's a long story. Anyway.
What is up, Eugene, in Minnesota? The Third.
Well, Minnesota is up.
We're just about everywhere.
Yes.
Yes. Also, my question is, so we have many hymns and prayers that are directed towards the cross. So my question is, does the cross have a spirit, or an angel that's associated with it? And did it before the crucifixion? Like when it was a tree in the woods, did it have a spirit and it was purified or something like that? Or who/what exactly are we praying to when we say, "Help me forever, most precious and life-giving cross of the Lord"? Father Andrew, please feel free to make references to the Dream of the Rood and or Ents as you see fit.
See, I know which Eugene this is. I could tell it from the call board. I was like, I know who this is.
I think mere weeks ago he may have been hanging out with a couple of my godsons.
Oh,
yes, that's true. I was. They're great people.
How about that? Well, okay. I mean, the Dream of the Rood is a good example, right? Because in the Dream of the Rood, the cross is actually talking,
right?
I don't think it, I mean, I don't know, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, Father, but I don't think it's correct to say that there is a kind of spirit or angel of the cross that we're talking to, but that when we say, you know, "Help me, life-giving cross of the Lord," it is a prayer to Christ, ultimately. You know, there are, I mean, we sometimes do address inanimate objects, you know, and like even within the Dream of the Rood, the whole thing is pitched as a dream, right? That this is an image, you know, the dreamer is speaking and saying, "I saw the cross and the cross said this," and so forth. But the whole thing that the cross talks about in there is all about Christ. It's not about some kind of independent agency. You know? So that's my understanding is that it is poetic language that is ultimately addressed towards Christ. You know?
Okay.
I don't know. You have anything to add or subtract or multiply or divide there, Father?
So the case of the cross is interesting and unique, right? So crosstalk, like the Dream of the Rood, actually goes back much earlier than that. The Gospel of Peter has the cross walking around and talking.
There you go.
Resurrection.
Yeah.
But on one hand, there are typically, especially the older you go in our liturgics and that kind of thing, there are distinctions made. So, for example, in the dismissal, we say, "by the power of the precious and life-giving cross."
Yeah.
Right. Rather distinguishing it from the saints who were asking Christ to save us through their prayers, right? It's the power of the cross, not the prayers of the cross, right? So there are those distinctions made. At the same time, when you look at how pieces of the cross are used as relics, right? Other than other material objects directly related to the crucifixion.
The nail.
I'm trying to think.
The crown of thorns.
Right. Like the lance, right?
Yeah.
Those kind of things. Those relics occupy a place that is closer to the relics of human saints than to, like, I don't know, the Holy Grail if we had it, right? Now you could say, well, that's because they're sort of in a certain way the relics of Christ himself, right? Because of course he rose from the dead, so we don't have, right? But I think there's something else going on there. And I'm inclined to think that trying to verify relics of the true cross is kind of a pointless exercise, because I think they all kind of are based on use, like we talked about
a long time
the Ship
ago.
of Theseus episode.
Yes.
And that means that there is some kind of spiritual reality associated with the cross that they're participating in some way.
Yeah.
And that might be what we're describing when we describe the power of the cross, right? In the baptismal service, we say that the cross is terrible unto adversaries, right? The sign of the cross, just its image, right? The way that's used. Yeah. So I think the cross occupies, among inanimate objects, a unique place, because I think it's even different than like the Ark of the Covenant, for example. This unique place, this unique and foundational place, and you find traditions that connect it like materially to the tree from paradise. Yeah. So I don't know that I could define exactly what that means, but I think it is in a different kind of space than any of those other relics or material objects.
Okay. Yeah, I like the mystery, the unknowing that you're that you're putting forth.
An apophatic answer to your question.
There you go.
The root of unknowing. Yeah.
Nice.
Not to mix Old English and Middle English literature too much. I know. But...
Any English is good English.
Well.
So...
Okay, what's your other question, Eugene? Come on, people are lining up behind you.
Yeah, I know. It's related. So there are patron saints of churches, but some churches are named after like the Dormition of the Mother of God, or the Transfiguration, or the Resurrection. So is it the same thing? With it's the power of the resurrection that's the patron of that church, or something like that, or is it just Christ Himself?
I mean, it can vary. Like I know, for instance, a church named for the Holy Trinity that has Saint Cuthbert as their patron.
Oh, sweet! That's my patron saint.
Oh, so there you go. Well, why didn't you say your name was Cuthbert rather than Eugene? I don't know, but
you might have been scared he would cudgel
good names.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's really just about what that community does. You know, I mean, I believe most, even though churches have like a saint they're named after. I mean, like the Dormition of the Mother of God, it's easy. The patron is obviously the Mother of God, right? Mm-hmm. But even though there's usually a saint they're named after, that's not the only saint they venerate. And so in a very real sense, every church, every person has multiple patron saints. There's not just one. There might be a main one, but there's not going to be just one, like exclusively, right? So, so yeah, it's a kind of a matrix of saints that are serving in a particular place.
Okay.
All right. Sodrecharas. All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks,
Eugene, for that little dose of Old English. Okay, so we've got Phil calling from South Carolina. Phil, welcome to the Lord of Spirits podcast.
Hey, fathers, how are y'all?
Oh, you are definitely from South Carolina. We're great.
We're fixing to answer your questions.
Well, this question goes way back yonder to episode 6.
Oh, man.
His Minister's Flame and Fire.
Yeah.
And Father Stephen, you mentioned something about the what you called it, the Western grid, and you had to get rid of the Western grid. And I didn't really understand what you were talking about.
Yeah, I think that's back when I was talking about spreadsheets. Yes. I had this axe to grind with Excel. No, I think this is a long time ago. So, I mean, I may have just been wrong also, that long ago. But I think what I was getting at with that was, so sometimes when folks come into the Orthodox Church and we have sort of a background and a way we've learned over time to look at things, especially when it comes to sort of theological and religious topics, the analogy I was using was like a spreadsheet or a grid, right? Where you have, okay, here's salvation, here's eschatology and the end of the world, here's doctrine of God, here's Christology, here's this, here's that. And so when people come to the Orthodox Church, they become inquirers, they become catechumens, they enter the church. Sometimes we approach it as, okay, well, I've got this spreadsheet. I just need to find out what the Orthodox answers are and plug those in instead of the old answers. Right? So I used to think that salvation was by faith alone, but now I think it's by like faith and works or something, right? And we just try to plug different answers into those same slots, right? And in order to really understand what's going on with Orthodox Christianity, we could say the same thing about the scriptures, right? We have a way that we view the world we live in and the way we read literature that's published today. And we could come to the Bible and try and read it the same way, right? And we get all kinds of weird results, right? Because the Bible was written in a different time, in different cultures, in different places, right? And so what we really need to do is, rather than trying to find the right answers to plug into the grid or the spreadsheet that we've already got, we need to get rid of that spreadsheet and try to approach it fresh. And that's very hard to do, right? That's something that takes time and work to do. And we have to kind of question our assumptions, right? Our assumptions and our presuppositions, and say, well, wait a minute. Is that really true? Right? Is that right? Or is that just how I've gotten used to looking at things, you know? In order so that we can really understand the scriptures, the faith, sort of on their own terms. That's what I think, or at least I hope now, I was trying to get at then.
I think I understand, yeah, because I'm a catechumen in my local Orthodox parish, and I've been listening to y'all since you pretty much started, and it has, how to say this, it has reoriented my views a lot. I came out of the Anglican Church, and a lot of things have gotten shifted in my points of view, and I thank you all for that. I mean, you all have really been eye-openers for a lot of that, but I think I understand now what you're talking about just finding correct, I don't know if correct is the right word, but well, that's the only thing I know how to say is correct. Correct things that, correct orientation and views, I guess, is the way to plug those things into your clean new spreadsheet.
Yeah.
Or just dump the spreadsheet entirely.
Yeah. Use a word processor. You know? Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, thank you very much for calling, Phil.
All right. Thank y'all, and y'all have a blessed evening.
You too. Well, we've got a call board that is full of Southerners. So next we have William in Tennessee. So William, welcome to Lord of Spirits podcast.
Thank you. It's good to be here, Father. It's good to keep Southern representation going.
Yeah, absolutely.
I too have two questions, if that is all right.
Yeah, absolutely. Sure.
What's your second question?
All right. So my second question is, I guess I can flip the order.
Yeah. Well, no, I meant your first question was, is it okay that you have two questions?
So three questions.
I have two questions, if that's all right, which is a statement, not a question.
Oh, okay. Okay.
I don't know. I think he's smuggling in a question there.
Yeah. But go ahead.
No. So, my first question is on the unbroken continuity of the church. which I'm going to list a number of beliefs I'm pretty sure that we hold first as a setup. So we proclaim that there's a visible church, the church militant. We say that the church is Israel and has an unbroken continuity with Israel. And I'm pretty sure we say that the entirety of the visible church cannot go apostate. We also have saints and early church writings saying that the church was created before all things. So with those down, my first question is, if Adam and Eve were part of the visible church, what/where is the unbroken continuity of the church militant from Adam and Eve to Abraham, especially in light of the first and third fall of man?
So here's the problem that I think is with that frame. It's the idea of a sort of, I'm trying to think about the best way to put this. Like you're looking at Genesis and trying to say, okay, where's the succession of laying on of hands that we talk about with apostolic succession in our time, right? Like, so clearly that's not there, right? So in what sense is I've even read people say that the church is uncreated, right? Which means that it's fundamentally the church is a divine experience that humans are having. I don't know, that's the best way to put it. And if that's the case, then that kind of eliminates this problem that you have between Adam and Abraham, right? Because God didn't leave. But I think it's to take certain kinds of language about the church and trying to transpose them onto other frames where it doesn't quite work, right? There is this continuity, but it's not a continuity in the way that apostolic succession is a continuity, right? That instead that they're both participating in the larger picture of God working in the world with his children. If that makes sense. Does that make sense?
I, on the other hand, would say challenge accepted.
Okay, great.
All right.
This is what the genealogies of Seth and Shem are.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Melchizedek is another example of this, right? Melchizedek is somebody who should, by all rights, be a pagan. He's named after a pagan god. He's the priest king of a pagan city. But he's still worshiping God Most High. He's still worshiping Yahweh. He's still worshiping the God who created the universe. So even beyond those genealogies, there were still people who still knew to the true God, aside from him having revealed himself to Abraham. So even during that period when we have those genealogies, we know where God was and we don't know where he wasn't.
Yeah, right. Yeah, what I was trying to say is, it's not that there's not a laying on of hands where there's a sense of like, okay, it's with this person here, I'm going to hand it to you, but the sense that
it's not an institutional priesthood. Yeah,
right. There's that the world has never been vacant of people who worship God. That's never been the case. Since Adam was made. Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It wasn't so much about the institutional priesthood, because I think it was talked about beforehand. The elders of the family of the patriarchs were the priests, so there was a priesthood. It just wasn't the Levitical and then the apostolic priesthood until the Levites and Christ.
Right. And you have these people presented as saints, like Enoch in the genealogy of Seth.
Yep.
Right.
Okay.
And so that's what those genealogies are doing. They're showing you the line of, those who are worshiping the true God through those periods. Despite how bad everything was getting in the line of Cain, there was still the line of Seth.
The remnant.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's
All
your
right.
second or third, depending on how you count it, question.
The second, because I counted right. So back in the Thanksgiving episode, you mentioned that Luther had this concept of the Eucharist as having a relationship between the hypostatic union of Christ's two natures with the bread and wine. And so that was super problematic, but we won't go into that here.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
Why is the hypostatic union of Christ's two natures with bread and wine super problematic?
Because if you say that the union between, say, Christ's body and the bread is the same kind of union as the union between Christ's divinity and his humanity, right? Then that would mean that as a hypostatic union, right, Christ was not united to a man. There was not a human person to whom, a human hypostasis, to whom the divine hypostasis of the Son was united. That's not how hypostatic union works, right? The divine person of the Son took upon himself human nature. So for his body to be united to bread in the same way, that would mean he would not be united to a particular piece of bread, a particular hypostasis of bread. He would be united to the nature of bread.
Which means bread can be saved.
Well, no, it would be that all bread would be the body of Christ.
Yeah, right.
And all wine would be the blood of Christ. So the analogy massively breaks down there, right? So, I mean, points to Luther for the analogy. He was trying to find a way to have the real presence directly in the elements so that Christ's body and blood were received through the mouth, over against the Calvinist tradition, which went a different way. And I say Calvinist tradition because nobody except Calvin has ever really had Calvin's view of the Eucharist. So he was trying to work with a Christological analogy, right? And the reason he was trying to work with a Christological analogy is that he was getting called a Eutychian by the Calvinists. He was being accused of, because Luther taught that Christ's body was ubiquitous, meaning it's everywhere, right? Yeah. Everywhere that Christ's divine nature is, his human nature must be also, and that includes his human body, right? Whereas the Calvinist tradition teaches that that is not the case, that Christ's human body is a human body, and therefore it is only in one place. That place is at the right hand of God. This is what they teach, so I don't know what that means, frankly. But Luther responded that the right hand of God is everywhere. So, and then they have what they refer to as the extra Calvinisticum, which is the idea that there are places where Christ's divinity is present, but his humanity is not. Calvinism teaches this.
Wow,
and
excarnation.
And this is why the Lutherans, while they were getting called Eutychians, right? Eutyches believed that Christ's human nature was sort of dissolved into his divine nature, like a drop of water falling into the ocean, right? So that's what they accused Luther of, because they said, well, if you're saying his body is everywhere, then it's not a human body anymore, right? You're a Eutychian. And he responded by calling them Nestorians. They're saying you're separating Christ's divinity and his humanity with the extra Calvinisticum. So Luther's trying to hold on to that, right? He's trying to hold on to something closer to Chalcedonian Christology, right? His Christology is better. And he's trying to navigate these accusations being thrown at him by the Calvinists, and he still wants to maintain the obvious scriptural truth that the elements of the Eucharist are the body and blood of Christ. He also has a lot of problems with the Roman Catholic version of transubstantiation, so he's trying to avoid that. And he uses this hypostatic union language as a compromise. And as I said, it doesn't work because of the way the hypostatic union works and the difference between nature and hypostasis.
Yeah, I mean, you get Christ becoming incarnate as bread. I mean, that's the only...
Yeah, sort of. Yeah.
Impanation. Not incarnation, but impanation.
And by the way, because I just don't care anymore, there were a bunch of people during the pandemic who are Orthodox, some of them priests, some of them professors, who were going around using Luther's analogy.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
In terms of the Eucharist. Okay, and this was specifically condemned at 2 councils in Constantinople in the 17th century as heresy. And the people who are proposing it are under the Patriarch of Constantinople. So this is their council. So if you hear anyone, no matter how well esteemed they are, no matter how smart and well educated they are, who is Orthodox, proposing Luther's analogy, you can tell them, hey, you might want to go back and read some of those councils. To be fair, they haven't been translated into English. You got to read them in Greek. But it's the case. But yeah, it doesn't work.
Some enterprising grad student out there, get your translation out.
Yeah, get those translated.
All right.
Irritate your professors if it happens to be one of the people who was saying that publicly.
Hey. So I don't know if that was more than you were looking for, William, or less, but hopefully it was in the ball.
That's right.
Oh, good. Okay. Great.
The Goldilocks solution.
All right. All right. Well, thank you very much for calling in, William.
Thank you, Father.
Okay. All right. Now we've got someone with a name after my own heart. Andrew calling from North Carolina. I mean, that was literally me at one point in my life. I was Andrew from North Carolina.
Check off another apostle also.
There we go. That's right. It's true. Andrew, welcome to Lord of Spirits podcast.
Christ is risen, fathers.
He truly is risen.
Okay, well, I share a little more with you, Father Andrew, than just having your name. This is your sponsor.
Oh, hey, this is my godfather, everybody.
Oh, he's calling it actually you too.
Oh, man. Hey, you've had your sister and your mom call into the show, yeah. Father. I mean, come on, at least I got my godfather call it.
It's true.
Okay, well, anyway, my question has to do with, it's interesting that you're talking about Luther being called a heretic by the Calvinists and stuff. I had a similar situation. I'm in a kind of a pan-Christian, it's basically a Christian apologetics Toastmasters club.
Okay.
And to make a long story short, we were talking about sin, and we got onto the thing about man being given clothes of skin, made out of skin. So I got to the point, and I thought, oh, geez, and Father Stephen mentioned this, that some of the fathers thought that the whole idea of God giving Adam clothes of skin has to do with the pre-fall body being transformed into the body after the fall. And one of the people, first of all, he went into this thing about he used to live in Utah, and he knew a lot of Mormons. And he said, you're dreading, and what's really weird about this is this group is really cool. I mean, we may not agree with each other, but everybody respects each other. And this guy's fairly new. And he said, you're treading on the verge of heresy. And I'm going, what? Well, I'm going in my mind, what? But it's like, so I was almost ready to tell him, what do you mean heresy? But I held back. So did I mess it up? Was there something there? I mean, he made some reference to the Mormons believing that, the Mormons believe that angels fell. We had the body of angels, and then we fell, and then we had, we got the bodies we have now. So I guess that's why he thought I was on the verge of heresy. So my first question is, did I screw up?
I mean, there is
no.
It is a strong, no. I mean, there's a strong thread in the Church Fathers that human bodies change with the fall. Right. And that there is, that garments of skin refers to that. It's not about, here's some leather outfits, guys. That there's this fundamental change in human bodies. Not that we become material, because Adam and Eve are created material, but there's a change in the way that the body is.
That's exactly the point I was trying to make. But anyway, this fall preceding that was, I don't know, with a lot of evangelical Protestants, they like to get it, since they're really into the substitution atonement. They're going, look, God had to kill something for man to have. They were really into that. Anyway, so my next question is...
Ask them to show you a sacrifice in the Old Testament where they wore the leather around.
Okay.
If they're saying that's a sacrifice. But go ahead.
Yeah. So my second question is, hey, what is this thing with the Mormons believe? I mean, what freaks this new guy out?
Let me add one piece on the first thing before we get into.
I was gonna say it's been a hot minute since I studied.
Okay, well, I could get into the Mormons too. Then after this,
yeah. Go ahead, Father. Yeah,
something to take them to in the Bible, because if this is other kinds of Christians, they may not be impressed with the Church Fathers. Is to take them to 1 Corinthians 15, like around verses 53 and 54. Where St. Paul talks about the resurrection, and he talks about the mortal being clothed upon with immortality, and the corruptible being clothed with incorruption. He uses that same clothed language about the resurrection.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And eternal life and the transformation of our bodies. That's the chapter where he's talking about our resurrection bodies. So you could kind of take him there and say, see, this is the reverse of what happened back then, and it's that same clothing language.
Right. Okay.
Garment language.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. With regards to the Mormons, number one, and I know we have some Mormon listeners, so hey, Mormon listeners, which I think is amazing. I'm so happy that they're listening. But one thing I should say about Mormonism is that it's a bit of a moving target, doctrinally speaking. Like,
oh boy,
they revise their teachings every so often, and this is just part of their religious way. Like, it's the way that it is. It can be frustrating even for faithful Mormons. So my understanding of the thing that you're talking about is, like, there's this notion of this pre-existence, right? This pre-mortal existence. And then we get into this mortal existence. In some ways, it's almost like Origen's kind of idea about pre-existing souls that kind of get dumped into bodies. Not exactly the same, but it certainly is kind of Origenistic in certain weird ways. And there's actually a number of things, I think, and I don't know if anyone's done any studies on this. It would be an interesting paper or book maybe to read. I'm not an Origen scholar, so I'm not qualified to. But I mean, there's a lot about Origenism which I think is reflected in Mormon theology. The key thing that I found when trying to parse my way through Mormon theology and the problems that I see with it, I mean, again, our Mormon listeners probably should have no big surprise that we would see problems with Mormon theology, is that fundamentally in Mormon theology, everything is uncreated. So everything, including God, right, is just a rearrangement of pre-existing stuff, which is why human beings can become just as God is, right? Yeah, I mean, and there was this saying, now it's largely considered to be like on the outs, but there was this saying by one of the early prophet presidents, Snow, I can't remember his first name off the top of my head now, but as man is, God once was, and as God is, man may become, which is a weird, like, there's this weird parallel to the whole Athanasian saying, right? That God became man so that man might become God. In fact, there's a whole school of thought within Mormonism attempting to show that the Church Fathers are basically teaching Mormon exaltation. But there's some significant differences between that and the doctrine of theosis. The biggest one being that, we do not regard God as ever having been a man, in the sense of, like, he used to be just a man and now he got to be God. Good job, God. Right? That's not our teaching at all. But I think that's part of what's going on. There's a whole different metaphysical matrix that's being used in Mormon teaching, which is really interesting to try to get a handle on. But it's got some very fundamentally different presuppositions to it than with Christianity.
Yes, I thought. Yeah, and you mentioned something about Origen, and he may have been picking up on that, and just anyway. So I'd never been challenged like that. In this group, like I said, we're all pretty cool. I mean, I did a talk on icons, and while most of the people there were cringing, they were pretty cool about it. They were respectful.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool.
I think the key difference on this very particular point with Mormonism is, so for Mormons, the population of this world, everyone was born from, they don't just believe in a heavenly father, they believe in a heavenly mother.
Right.
So there's actually a god and a goddess.
Yep.
Who gave birth to everybody who's going to be alive. And then, so for them, the fall that person was referring to is a fall into materiality.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So becoming material was the bad thing. And that plays out, I think, in the way in which asceticism is practiced within Mormonism.
Oh, yeah.
Right. The things of the material, right? No alcohol, no, right? Caffeine even.
Right.
Although there's some exceptions to that now. Right. All that. It's very material world denying in terms of the form of the asceticism, and that's related to that. Whereas for the church fathers, for St. Paul, for the scriptures, what we're talking about is not a fall into materiality, but a fall into mortality.
Right.
That it's our mortal flesh that's subject to sin and to temptation and to the lusts of the flesh. Now there's been a change in our body. Not we used to be immaterial and now we're material, and being material is bad.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Geez, as a matter of fact, I just got done reading Robin Phillips's new book on the creation.
The first 3 pages of that are brilliant. The rest is good too.
Yeah, that would be the foreword that Father Stephen wrote.
Oh. Yeah, I was gonna say, I was trying to remember who wrote the foreword to this.
There you go. All right. Well, thank you for calling. Very nice to hear from you. And
God bless you, fathers.
All right. Okay. Continuing.
That is a good book, by the way.
Yeah.
Robert
Continuing
Phillips.
our stroll through the South, we've got David calling from the Old Dominion, the Commonwealth of Virginia, the place where I was born. David, welcome to the Lord of Spirits podcast.
Thank you, fathers.
What is on your mind?
Yeah, so I noticed during the service on Holy Thursday evening, there's a very interesting prayer after the Psalms. It says, when your glorious disciples were enlightened at the washing of the feet before the supper. Was just wondering what the connection, if any, that language has to the prayers that are said when somebody is baptized. The idea of washing and then enlightenment. And then that prayer also goes on to mention Judas subsequently being fixed in his greed after his partaking of the supper, sort of paralleling that language to, partaking of the Eucharist unto condemnation.
I mean, that is a cool reading of that hymn, and I think very apt. I don't know what else to say other than good job. But yeah, I mean, the connection of water and illumination, and I think, isn't there this, like, it's not explicit in the Gospels, right, where that Christ baptizes his disciples, but isn't there this tradition or idea, Father, that is a thing?
Well, so the washing of the feet is in St. John's Gospel.
Yeah.
And interestingly, St. John's Gospel is the gospel that doesn't have the institution of the Eucharist.
Right.
It has the foot washing instead. And the Eucharist itself gets skipped in his narration. But also in St. John's Gospel, St. John makes it very pointedly that though after the death of St. John, after the imprisonment of St. John the Forerunner, Christ's disciples were baptizing, that he himself was not. But I think an important thing is the little dialogue that we gloss over between St. Peter and Christ during the foot washing.
Yeah.
Where St. Peter, as usual, St. Peter's always trying to figure out the right answer, like what he's supposed to say, and he keeps getting it wrong. in a very human way, right? So Christ comes to wash his feet. He's like, oh no, you can't wash my feet. I should wash your feet. And then Christ is like, well, if I don't wash your feet, then you'll have no part of me. And then he's like, oh, well, in that case, wash everything. Wash my head, wash my whole body.
Yeah, he's like, no, you're already clean. You just need your feet washed.
Right. You have already been cleansed, and someone who's already been cleansed just needs their feet to be washed. Right. And then when he's done,
cleansing is the baptism of John.
Well, he says at the end that he has done this to set an example. As I have washed your feet, you need to wash each other's feet. Right. And so I think this is actually tied to repentance after baptism. Right. And that you've been washed, you're clean. Right. And this is connected to mitzvot. Or not mitzvot, mikvot.
Mikvah, yeah.
I confused a mikvah and a mitzvah. But to mikvot, to, right, people, you would have to ritually wash, right? But if you're clean, you've been walking on the road, it's just your feet that have gotten dirty. You've been out there in the world and your feet have gotten dirty. You're not sort of starting out at square one, right? But that you've picked up out there in the world does need to be cleansed. And the disciples of the church, they do it for each other. Right? I think this is St. John's way of describing the same thing that St. Matthew is describing in chapter 17 and 18 of his gospel, in terms of the forgiveness of sins after baptism being mediated through the community of the church. Because they're washing each other's feet, right? Christ doesn't say you should go and wash other people's feet in general. He says each other's, right? And so I think this hymn is connected to that this is talking about repentance as a kind of second baptism.
Yeah, right.
The way that, say, St. Simeon the New Theologian will talk about tears of repentance as a second baptism. That this is now something that we provide for each other within the community of the church, right? Whereas Judas walks away and is darkened and is sort of the prototypical one who receives unworthily, which is one of the big meditations of that service on Holy Thursday. Right, he's sort of the archetypal unworthy recipient of the Eucharist. And that sort of thrusts him further into darkness rather than enlightening him.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. I don't know. Does that answer your question, David?
Yeah, I think so. So, I mean, the washing of the feet seems to be more of a parallel to bearing one another's burdens rather than the establishment of another sacrament or another baptism for the disciples.
Yeah, it's an extension in a way of baptism. It's like confession is often called a second baptism. So it participates in that in a renewing way. So, all right, thank you very much for calling.
Thank you.
All right, now we're going to now we're breaking our southern streak, and now Luke from Michigan. Luke, welcome to the Lord of Spirits podcast.
See, Michigan, we've had some Michiganders, we've had a Minnesota caller. They are so far north that I think they compensate for multiple, like, Virginians and Tennesseans.
Especially if, like, I don't know, if is Luke, you're not in the Upper Peninsula, are you, Luke?
Nope, lower.
Oh, okay. That's okay.
You're
That's
a troll then.
We've got the hand.
That's right.
You live underneath the Mackinac Bridge.
Point to the hand, say, here's where I am.
It's true. It's true. Well, welcome, Luke. What is on your mind?
Christ is risen.
Truly, indeed, he truly, absolutely, it's risen.
A number of your recent episodes have referred to the soul as the life of the body, sort of juxtaposed against a thing. I understand that we don't accept everything Plato said about the soul, for sure. But as I've read saints like
Gregory of Nyssa and John of Damascus, it kind of seems, at least from how I've read it, it kind of seems like the soul is more like an immaterial thing that communicates life to the body instead of being that life itself. In particular, reading some of the Christological debates in the 5th through 7th centuries, you often see this analogy being used pretty much by everybody in different ways of the soul and the body coming together to form one human being. So I'm trying to understand this sort of terminological way that the show has been using it, because I guess I'm a little confused because it seems like the soul is an activity of the body in this system rather than an essence or something like that. So am I misunderstanding something you guys have said? I know you have a whole episode on it, so forgive me. Or can you point me to an Orthodox work that might help me kind of reconcile this thing?
That's straight to you, Father Stephen.
Okay. Well, part of the issue is, we're reading things in English, and the English language tends to reify everything, meaning it tends to make, we talk about everything as if it's a thing.
It's a very
right
Anglo-Saxon thing to want to do.
Yeah. So, and here I'll give another example. How many times have you heard someone or read in an English translation of a theological work that Christ has a human nature?
Yeah, you see that for sure.
Right, and that's speaking of his human nature as if it's a thing, right? But if you understand his human nature as a thing that's attached to this other thing that is his divine nature, you're an Nestorian, right? Sort of by definition, right? But even when we try to think about, no, right? We say the theologically correct way to think is he takes upon himself human nature, which he shares with us. That's not something our brain is used to thinking about, because we try and turn it back into a thing. We try and turn it back into his body, just his physical body, or we try to turn it back into, right? Like that's not how we're used to thinking about things. But a nature, very clearly in Greek, is not a thing. It's like a directedness of being, right? But you read any English translation of Aristotle, things have natures, again, as if natures are things possessed by something, right? And so the same thing happens with the soul when we translate into it and talk about it in English, is it kind of gets reified in a way that everything else does. Our will, as if our will is a thing that's inside of us, right? Rather than a movement of the soul, which is
Our
how
willing. It would almost work
like
better
St.
as
Maximus. Yeah, St. Maximus literally describes like movements of the will. These are movements of the soul. And then when we hear the phrase movements of the soul, we're like, okay, so the soul is a thing and it moves, right? Well, that's not what he means, right? He doesn't mean this object is physically moving through space, right? Right. So that movement is even sort of analogical language. And I think, frankly, the best things to read to kind of understand this is, and there's plenty of these out there, read the patristic condemnations of Origen, where they talk about how Origen viewed the soul.
Are you talking like the 543 anathemas?
Not just those. There's those, but there's also before that. Pretty much everybody, centuries before that, had to declaim Origen. I know there's a lot of Origenists out there who want to act like, oh, everyone loved Origen until that mean St. Justinian came along. Yeah. But that's absolutely false, right? So you can read St. Jerome and him talking about the errors of Origenism. They're all over the place, right? During the 5th century especially. And even those, there's problems with how, we even have joked on the show about, your soul being a sphere, right? Because that's how it's translated in English. Origen didn't actually think your soul was a sphere. That's referring to a whole set of ideas in Plato.
Yeah.
Right, about the sphere as the perfect form and all of these things, right? So that's a way of getting at this Platonic understanding of the soul that Origen was holding to in denial of Scripture. But I think if you read some of those, the differentiation they make between Origen's view of the soul and the Christian view of the soul will help disambiguate this a little. Not completely, because this is hard to talk about in English or any other language, but will help at least separate those in your mind a little bit, some of the distinctions between the two.
Well, you've got some homework.
Sounds good. Thank you. I'm looking.
He asked for something to read, so.
That's right. Exactly. All right. Thank you very much for calling. All right. Continuing our tour of the frozen north, we've got Robbie from Wisconsin.
Hello, fathers. Can you hear me?
We hear you. Welcome to Lord of Spirits podcast. Christ is risen.
True. Oh, now I have to make a decision, don't I?
Sorry. I'm making it hard for people.
Just say, you betcha.
Well, I'm going to a Greek church, so I'm going to just skirt around the whole problem by saying alethos anesti.
Okay. Although, I do know some Greeks that say alethos o Kyrios.
Oh, man.
It's truly, it's a thing. Yeah.
Okay. Well, truly he is risen. He is risen indeed. But
why you got to ambiguate everything, Father Andrew?
I'm not trying to make enemies right now.
I do have a degree and a half in English literature, so I mean, this is how books get written.
That's your job. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, but Father Stephen knows like 1,000 ancient languages. So,
are there 1,000 ancient languages? I don't know. Depends on how far back you go.
Do you count dialects?
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. If you're gonna count.
Anyway, I do have a question.
Yeah.
Wonderful. So I've heard both of you talk before about Daniel and kind of just almost just briefly mentioning how the fourth beast is Rome. And so I'm sure you guys are possibly aware that there's this whole way of reading that where, it's all about the Seleucid Empire or kingdom and all about Antiochus Epiphanes and everything. And I think definitely towards when you start to get towards the end of Daniel with some of those other prophecies about the kings of the north and south and the ram and the goat and whatnot, it really does seem like that is kind of directly talking about the time of the Seleucid and Ptolemaic kingdoms. My question is the fourth beast / the bottom, the iron and clay part of the statue earlier in Daniel, are those sort of directly referring to the Seleucid Empire and Antiochus, for example, as the little horn or something? But then the fathers, such as Jerome and others who interpret it as Rome, are kind of elevating that and kind of seeing that type of figure and that type of kingdom and that type of empire fulfilled in Rome? Or are they really seeing it as like, no, Daniel is talking about Rome? Like there is a succession of empires and it ends with Rome. And if that's the case, why then at the end of Daniel does it seem to flip back, or am I even understanding that wrong? So I don't know, maybe if you could just talk about that, because I also know that, for example, with like the abomination of desolation, there's a way of reading that, which is the abomination of desolation is Antiochus sacrificing a pig on the altar, but then Christ talks about the abomination of desolation as future tense. And so is that him saying that, no, that did happen, and
but it will be kind of fulfilled again, or ultimately in what's going to happen to the temple? Or is he just saying, no, that's one-to-one talking about what is going to happen? Does that make sense?
What do you think, Father? Does that make sense?
So, yeah. So, so where to start? So you are correct in terms of the ram and everything. That is referring, and the abomination of desolation is referring to Antiochus IV Epiphanes and the Seleucid dynasty. So one thing we have to remember with the book of Daniel is that it is politely a composite book and impolitely a complete mess. In the sense that, right, and you could very quickly, even as purely an English reader, get a sense of this by comparing Daniel in the Orthodox Study Bible to Daniel in any other Bible.
Right.
There are these extra chapters.
There's extra chapters. There's the Aramaic sections of the Hebrew version.
It begins and ends in Hebrew, and then the middle chunk is Aramaic, and it changes at a seemingly random point in the first case, in the middle of a story, from Hebrew to Aramaic. And if you're into this, I at one point wrote a PhD seminar paper on this and wasted a lot of my life. But the theories out there, because no one knows the theories out there. There's a Dutch scholar who has spent seemingly his whole career just on this, on why are the Aramaic parts in Aramaic and why are the Hebrew parts in Hebrew. Because there's all these theories. There's theories that it was originally all in Hebrew, but the Hebrew was lost except for the beginning and the end, and so they filled in with the Aramaic version. Or it was all in Aramaic originally and something got changed in Hebrew and everything else, and it's deliberate, and this is why, and it's deliberate, but no, that's why. There's a huge debate about when Daniel was even written, and whether it was all written at the same time. And there are people who think it was all written in the 2nd century, and so some of them even think it might have been originally in Greek, and then parts of it were translated into Hebrew and Aramaic. So it's everywhere. Right? It's all over the place. And it's very clear when you read it. I mean, again, even just reading it in English, even just reading, not leaving the Greek version out of it, that you have a series of sort of discrete stories, right? That aren't, it doesn't directly form a narrative, right? You have these stories regarding Daniel. Then you have the story of the 3 youths who are sort of friends of Daniel, and then you have a series of visions that Daniel has, right? That sort it goes in this apocalyptic direction. It's kind of a different genre, and it moves through a long span of time, from Babylon into the Persian Empire. So all that is to say, it can be a mistake to try to say, okay, well, here in this chapter, in this vision of Daniel, it's talking about the Seleucids. Therefore, when he's interpreting Nebuchadnezzar's vision in this chapter, this dream of Nebuchadnezzar's has to be commensurate with this vision that Daniel has in this other chapter, and that's not necessarily the case. Those could be discrete prophetic visions, discrete prophecies talking about different but overlapping things. So I think it's pretty clear that the iron and iron mixed with clay is Rome. And this isn't just a case of Christian interpretation. This is a case of pre-Christian Jewish interpretation.
Okay.
So we have Jewish texts that are interpreting this as Rome, and that were interpreting, Jewish folks will fight you on this, but it's historically demonstrable that the bit about Daniel predicting the number of years between himself and the Messiah coming
The week,
is not a Christian innovation. It's not us Christians trying to read that back in. There's a reason why in the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD, there were all these people showing up claiming to be the Messiah. There's a reason why the Jewish revolts happened in the 1st century AD, and that's because there were Jewish people reading it that way, reading Daniel that way, and saying, now's the time. And there was this kind of messianic fervor. Now's the time when the stone is going to come and destroy the Roman Empire, right, and grow into a mountain, right? They were reading it that way. And so Christians took that reading over. Non-Christian Jews obviously decided, well, that was wrong, right? They said, clearly Bar Kokhba wasn't the guy, right? So we were reading that wrong and sort of scrapped that mode of interpretation, whereas Christians kept it because, right, it works for us. And you find that even that language was even used in some of the Paschal hymns I noted this year, of Christ being that mountain that grew to encompass, right, the earth, using the language from that vision. So I would say that's pretty clearly Rome and the succession of empires. And that's not just a later church fathers thing. They're continuing a line of interpretation from pre-Christian Judaism that Christianity kept and kind of got scrapped as incorrect by other Jewish communities. Last bit, I think, in terms of what you asked, is the abomination of desolation. That is what Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes did. That is also something that is a pattern that is going to be fulfilled in the future, according to Jesus, by the Antichrist, who we are going to talk about in 1 month.
Ooh,
2 episodes from now on Lord of Spirits.
You just heard it here first, everybody.
Yes.
We're going to talk about the Antichrist in June. if the second coming doesn't happen before that.
Yes. Unless he stops us.
That's right. Unless the Antichrist gets us. All right, Robbie. I hope that that was helpful to you.
Okay. Thank you, fathers.
You're welcome. You're welcome. All right. We're going to go ahead and take our second break, and we'll be right back with the third half of the Lord of Spirits.
Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung will be back in a moment to take your calls on the next part of the Lord of Spirits. Give them a call at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
This year's Ancient Faith Women's Retreat, with the theme, The Myrrh Bearers, Following Christ in Grief and Joy, will be held November 9 to 12 at Antiochian Village. For details and to register, visit store.ancientfaith.com/events. That's store.ancientfaith.com/events. A new edition of The Good Samaritan, a first-of-its-kind catechism written specifically for young people to communicate the unchanging truths of the Orthodox faith, is now available at store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back now with the Lord of Spirits, with Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung. If you have a question, call now at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO.
And we're back. Man, Elisa Bielicich Davis is sure getting a lot of voiceover work these days. It's a bunch. Since she plugged her event, we should plug our event. So everybody, the end of October 26th through 29th, the Lord of Spirits Conference, aka LoserCon, because LOSER. Yeah. Happening at the Antiochian Village as well. That's just the place you have these things. And I think there's like somewhere between 15 and 20 tickets left. There are people who have started renting cabins up at the camp to come to the conference. So come, everybody. There's going to be a D&D tournament, of course. That's Father Stephen's one request. He didn't ask for it.
That was not a request. That was a demand.
Oh, excuse me.
That was the condition for me to come.
I was trying to spin you as nobler than you are.
Yeah, don't do that. You'll be disappointed.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, it's going to be a great time. I probably will see at least one person in a bat costume. I mean, I fully expect to see more than that, but I mean, what are the odds that it's not going to happen? That's probably pretty small. So yeah, again, stored at ancientfaith.com/events, and you can get your ticket. There's no more rooms available at the Antiochian Village, but you can get a commuter ticket and go get a room wherever you like, or you can also get a commuter ticket and separately rent yourself a cabin for you and 7 of your closest friends. Or it could just be you. It could be just you.
Or stay at the RV park nearby.
That's totally a thing as well.
Or sleep in your car at the Sheets down the road.
Yeah, you can't do it in the parking lot at the Antiochian Village. But if you could work something out with the Sheets, more power to you. Sheets has cheer wine, by the way. Southerners, the Sheets has cheer wine. So I'm just putting that up there. If you come, you can get your cheer wine.
It's a pretty nice fried dipping sauce, I must say. Free air and water for your tires and car also.
Yes. So my final threat for the evening, if people don't call, is to read from the Sagas of the Icelanders. And you can hear me mispronounce Old Norse names. So
that's just a minor threat.
Yeah. So we do have Rachel calling from Kansas. Rachel, welcome to the Lord of Spirits podcast.
Hi, excited to be here. Big fan.
Is this the Rachel that I met in Dallas?
Yes, indeed it is.
I knew it. I could just tell by the way your name said Rachel from Kansas on the call board.
Yeah, it's Rachel from Kansas, whom you met in Dallas.
By way of Dallas.
Deal, Rachel.
Yeah. By way of Dallas. That's right. Yeah. Well, Rachel, welcome to Lord of Spirits podcast. What is on your mind?
All right. Well, I really enjoyed the recent series you guys did on the sacraments. I found that very informative and interesting. I did come away with 2 questions specifically, hoping you could have some insight for me.
Okay, we'll give it a shot.
All right. So the first one I had was about monasticism, and I was kind of wondering what is the purpose of conferring the monastic tonsure on celibate priests outside of the monastic community context? Now, I have no doubt that way of life requires a high deal of asceticism, but doesn't seem to have the kind of leaving the world aspect that the episode seemed to allude that was pretty indicative of the purpose of the monastic tonsure. So priests who are still involved in parish communities and in diocesan leadership, I was just kind of curious what the purpose was there of involving the monastic tonsure.
Yeah, I mean, so this is definitely a thing. You get these higher monks or igumens and so forth who are just serving in parishes and not living in monasteries and probably just have their own apartment, their own house. Some of them used to be in monasteries. So there is that living connection with monasticism, but a lot of them, no. A lot of them. And so here's the ideal. The ideal is that they get that tonsure so that they then have a form of life which has a higher intensity of spiritual discipline, so that they can to make up for the fact that they frankly don't have a wife at home saying, "What is the matter with you?" Which is a really important thing that wives do for husbands. Because the secret about men as they age is that they get weirder. And if there's not a wife there telling them...
Man, my wife is going to be gone when I get home.
What's the matter with you? Then
she thinks I'm going to get weirder than this.
It's true. But, it's a mitigating experience to be married as you get weirder and older. But monasticism can also help to prevent the weirdness in a different way, although monks can definitely be weird. I've known some weird monks. But the point being that they don't have the asceticism of family, and so they're taking on this other form of asceticism. That I would say is the ideal, so that they live as monks, and usually if they're living in that way, they are connected to a monastery. They had to get tonsured somewhere, and would have this living connection with the monastery, maybe visiting every so often, certainly being instructed by maybe the abbot or some other spiritual father. I also know at the same time there are some, God bless them, who go through the tonsure as pure formality and do not live as monks. that makes zero sense to me. I don't know why anyone would do that. It's, but that is a thing. But I also know some that do essentially live as monks. Maybe they don't take on every single form of the outward discipline. Like, for instance, they may cut their hair and or their beards. Normally inside a monastery, a monk does not cut his hair or beard unless it gets really in the way, which, that's a thing. But sometimes when a monk lives outside the monastery for a while, even if they're from a monastery, they may choose to cut their hair and beard just because, living in the world, maybe they have a secular job or something like that. It can require that. But yeah, so there's kind of a range I've noticed in those who do that. I mean, obviously I'm married. I have 4 children, so I don't know what it's like to live like that. But I've known some, celibate priest monks who are not in monasteries who basically live like monks. And then I've noticed some that it's just a title and doesn't really seem to actually be part of their life. And I mean, that's between them and their bishop ultimately and God. But that's what I have to say about that. Anything you want to add, Father Stephen?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and court controversy.
All right, go for it.
So part of this is a modern deviation from the historical pattern, to be honest. So the historical pattern was that the clergy at a parish church in a village or something were married. And monastic clergy were at monasteries.
Yeah.
And bishops, generally, if they weren't at a monastery in residence, they would have monastics living around them, right? Like St. Augustine famously did that. Because they were generally monastics. And when you start getting to the modern period, you start getting more and more exceptions to this. If you read the writings of modern Orthodox saints, many of them decry this and say this is a bad idea. That this makes it really hard on monastics, having to be a monastic living in the world, right? And there's also a variation in practice, like in the U.S. in different jurisdictions. So there are some Orthodox jurisdictions in the U.S. where most ordained single men are expected to be celibate but have not received monastic tonsure. And then in one of those jurisdictions I'm thinking of, if they get made a bishop, they get tonsured on the way to being made a bishop.
Yeah.
In another one I'm thinking of, some of the bishops have never received monastic tonsure. So there's now a difference in modern practice in that regard. And as I said, not me, modern saints, right, have said this is very dangerous and very difficult for the monastic person to not be in that monastic environment. And I think, frankly, recently it's gotten even more difficult and more dangerous because we've got folks who are monastics who seem to be spending a lot of time on the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not in charge of them. I'm not going to tell them to get off the internet any more than I tell everybody to get off the internet. But I mean, like, not in particular, not by name, I'm not in charge of them to where I can order them to get off the internet. But it seems to me to be very dangerous for someone who's trying to live a monastic way of life to spend a lot of time on the internet. Because of how bad it is for everyone to spend a lot of time on the internet. So I think we've got to be honest in the sense of being self-critical. And I have criticized, again, who cares? I'll just be honest. I've criticized the Roman Catholic Church in particular for being kind of one thing on paper and one thing in actual practice. So I think if I'm going to criticize that, then I think we as Orthodox people have to be honest and say, yeah, there's one way things are supposed to work on paper, and in our modern contemporary practice, a lot of times it doesn't work that way, and it's not always good that it doesn't work that way.
Yeah. You said you had one more question, Rachel.
I do. Okay, so my second question was about holy water. So your episode was the first time I'd heard it referred explicitly as a sacrament. And I was curious about what's different about holy water as opposed to Holy Unction or the Eucharist, for example, where they're restricted to just those who are in communion with the church. But holy water seems to be a lot more accessible to those outside the church. Like I've heard of non-Orthodox Christians getting their homes blessed with holy water, and then at Theophany, the water's just there for kind of everyone. So what makes it more, as a sacrament, more safe for those outside the church to also participate in?
Yeah, and even if they happen to be in church when holy water is being sprinkled around on people,
right?
Like the priest doesn't say, "Now, are you Orthodox? Are you?" Literally, it's just
right.
Get everybody as much as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, it's the usage, right? I mean, we tend to think of sacraments are these things that are reserved for Orthodox Christians, but that's not like a constituent element of a sacrament, okay. Especially because baptism, we give only to non-Orthodox Christians.
True.
So it's just the question of what is this used for? So holy water is used for blessing creation, right? So I mean, whatever we use it to bless everything. So it's just like it's like saying, well, if holy unction is for the forgiveness of sins and for the healing of body as well, couldn't we just trade it out and say, well, we're just going to give unction today instead of the Eucharist? Because theoretically, the Eucharist is also for the healing of the soul and body, right? Shouldn't they be interchangeable? But they're not, because the way in which they're used is different, and the whole rite around each one is set up differently. As a result of that, you read the actual prayers that are indicated. Like if you listen to the prayers for the great blessing of the water, which we talked a little bit about, they go on and on, which is why we didn't read the whole thing. It really is about this cosmic scope, of God working in the whole creation, right? So, I mean, that's what I would have to say about that. I don't know, Father Stephen, you got something else or more or different?
Well, yeah, I mean, related to that, I think it's the right. So, for example, the Eucharist and unction includes not only the blessing of the oil, but the administration of the oil.
Yeah.
Right. So when I'm giving the sacrament of holy unction, most of the time I'm not consecrating the oil. I have oil that I save from Holy Wednesday, and I go and visit someone in the hospital and anoint them with that oil, right? So for that person in the hospital, the sacrament is the being anointed, right? Same thing with the Eucharist, right? The sacrament of the Eucharist is not just the consecration of the gifts. It's also the giving of the Eucharist, right? The administration to the person. Whereas with the blessing of holy water, the sacrament is the blessing of the water. It is the sanctification of the water, not its administration.
Okay.
So that water that's been blessed is then used for these other things, right? And that's a difference. And we use that water to go and bless other things, right? So my parishioner has a business, right? They have a restaurant. I go and I bless the restaurant. And I throw holy water everywhere, right? It's not like, okay, now only Orthodox Christians are allowed to come in here and use the equipment and eat the food, right? It's blessed for everyone. And this makes the great blessing of the waters and holy water an important sacramental reality, because this is a place where we see the fact that the church has this role in relation to the entire world. Right? That the whole world is blessed through the church, even those who aren't within it, right? Mm-hmm. And this is a place where we see that, where there are other sacraments that are internal realities of the church community.
Does that answer your question, Rachel?
Absolutely. I always come away with a lot more to think about. So thank you so much.
That's what we like to hear. All right. Thank you very much for calling. Okay. Well, next we have Dan, representing Indiana. Dan, welcome to Lord of Spirits podcast.
Thank you, Fathers. I had a question about Genesis, something that kind of came out from reading the Orthodox Study Bible. Specifically, when it talked about the tree of life being planted in Genesis 2, it basically says the tree of life in the middle of paradise, or in the middle of the garden. And then later, when Adam and Eve are trying to hide, when they're trying to hide from God, it says they hid in the middle of the tree of the garden, I think is how it's rendered in the Orthodox Study Bible. I'm familiar with that word there. The tosilon could be, like collective, like the woods, and I know other translations use that. But it jumped out at me because it's singular, and it's other English translations in the Septuagint have the singular tree there too. And it kind of got me thinking, like, is this, you will surely die, and to avoid the implications of that, Adam and Eve then hide in the midst of the tree of life, or is that reading way too much into the text? And if so, if it's not, who else has thought that in church history, and where can I learn more?
Oh, wow, that's an interesting question. So this is Genesis chapter 3, verse 8. Yeah, I mean, the way it usually gets translated is plural, like among the trees. I'm looking at the, I don't know if you have this in front of you, Father, but
it's a genitive singular in that case, Father.
Yeah.
But it could be collective, and that's kind of what I'm, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it's interesting that there's multiple English translations using the singular there, and I was wondering if there's a reason for that.
Yeah. I'm checking something in the original Hebrew, because I think there's two different prepositions there. I already checked Genesis 2, so I'm checking Genesis 3.
I don't think there's any variation of the Dead Sea Scrolls. I'm checking that too.
Just checking out the Dead Sea Scrolls. Okay.
Hey, there's a website. Yeah, yeah.
Is it Byzantine, or is it something else? I've been looking on the web for something and curious. If you found something, I'd love.
Say that again.
I'm just curious if you found some source for it. I'd really love to learn where.
Yeah, I mean, knowing a little bit about the way translation works, I mean, since I guess, and I don't read Hebrew, but Father Stephen does. It is plural in the Hebrew. Yeah, I mean, the word that's there in the Greek is xilu, right? Which is just wood. So for instance, Christ is said to be, and in the 15th antiphon of Matins of Holy Friday, the very famous hymn, he is hung upon the tree, is he who suspended the earth of the waters is suspended on the tree. But what it says literally in the Greek is he's suspended on epixilu. I think I'm not sure if that's the correct declension, but it's the same word, right? Upon the wood. So yeah, I don't know. I wouldn't read too much into it as a singular, suggesting that this is the tree of life or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. The Hebrew in both cases, the preposition is batok, and batok actually literally means between.
Yeah.
And so it's translated, the first time it's batok hagan, right? Literally between the garden, right? But that doesn't make sense in English, right? And so the tree we don't say the tree of life was between the garden. To make sense of it, we say it's in the middle, right?
Yeah.
Of the garden. Whereas in Genesis 3, when they hide batok eitz, which is literally between the trees.
Yeah, and then in the Greek it just says in the middle of the wood of paradise. Literally.
Yeah. So, yeah. So I wouldn't necessarily think that, and especially because later on in Genesis 3 it talks about, hey, we need to keep Adam and Eve away from that tree. That's the whole point of their expulsion from the garden. I would think the dialogue would play out differently if they were hiding at that tree and, say, trying to eat from it, right? Because of God's concern that they not, right, come anywhere near it.
Yeah, I mean, you would think that the dialogue would be more like, did you eat from this tree?
Yeah, or get away from that tree. You don't know what, yeah.
So, sorry to disappoint, Dan, but I mean, it's an interesting idea.
No, not at all. That makes sense, and I really appreciate your thoughts. Thank you very much.
All right.
It is
live textual criticism.
It is good to find those things and test them. So you're going at this in the right way. It's just when you find things, you got to test them, and some of them will pan out and some of them won't.
Exactly. So, cool question. All right, we're going to take just a couple more so that Father Andrew can go to bed.
Wimp.
I know. Well, hey, I'm an hour ahead of you, so. But of course, you don't sleep ever.
6.5 hours. I'll sit. Anyway.
All right, we've got Hannah calling from your home state of California. So, Hannah, welcome to the Lord of Spirits podcast.
Hi, Fathers. Thank you.
What is on your mind? We're listening.
So I'm listening with my daughter, Libby, and we've just started over at Sons. Well, we just finished Sons of God Equal to the Angels, and it got us thinking about. So Libby's also going to participate in the St. Nino pilgrimage in Georgia, and so we've been talking about St. Gabriel, and found out that when he was a child, he flew. And that got us thinking about other miracles in the lives of other saints, like St. Porphyrius levitating during Divine Liturgy, and St. Philip being transported to the Ethiopian eunuch, or from the Ethiopian eunuch. And we were wondering if these are completely supernatural, like contrary to the human nature miracles, or if they could be seen as kind of a what to expect when expecting the resurrection.
Yes. Well, yes, and the first one in the sense that this is not normal for most human beings at this stage in human history.
Right. Are they? We're kind of wondering because in the Sons of God episode you talked about theosis, and so we were wondering if these are sort of signs of theosis.
Yeah, they're behaving normally for saints.
Okay.
It was said about Saint Nicholas, the Saint Nicholas who came up earlier, that he could be in multiple places at once or move very quickly, even in his lifetime. And we saw, Christ, of course, after the resurrection, could just sort of go through doors without opening them. Yeah, I mean, this is normal saint behavior.
Yeah, and we shouldn't see it as like superpowers, right? It's
no.
I now have the power to bilocate, right? Like Duo Damsel in the Legion of Superheroes. It's the way it's described. Like you gave good examples, right? Like with Saint Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, right? This is a thing he experienced, but it's not like he could just teleport when he wanted to or something, right? That this is part of his experience of God and with God. And when you're that advanced in your experience of God, those kind of things become normal for you, which are incredibly strange to us.
Okay. We're also kind of wondering, like, if these were things that would have been normal for humanity before the fall?
So on one hand, we weren't corrupted, right? But on the other hand, Adam and Eve also were immature. So I don't know. There's no indication in Genesis that they were doing that kind of thing.
Yeah. There's related questions, right? So some of the fathers don't even think there was any real span of time.
Yeah, right.
Or any long span of time between creation and expulsion. Of course, that's within the realm of we don't even know how they experienced time, right? Before. Right? But it is important. It is important that the life of the world to come, our bodies after the resurrection, are not just a return to what was.
Okay.
They are the fruition of God's plan for what was. So it isn't that would have been normal for Adam and Eve, right, man and woman, before the fall. It's that would have, if hypothetically the fall hadn't happened, that would have become normal for them over the course of their lives with God.
Okay. So when we're thinking about like the restoration of creation, it's not a going back to what was before the fall. It's
right.
not restoring.
It's going beyond that. Oh. Right. So think about Adam and Eve as like infants, right? That, an infant can't walk yet. Right? At some point, mature human nature will allow them to walk, right? But they're not there yet. Right.
Okay. So we were also, along the same vein, thinking about Adam and Eve in the garden talking with animals, and wondered if that was another aspect of the resurrection.
Narnia?
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, I love those books. Wow, this is actually harder, I think, than the rest.
I got this one if you want me to.
Oh, go for it. Yeah.
Well, the only actual
wardrobe.
The only actual example we get of that is the serpent, and the serpent, of course, is not just a snake.
Right.
Right. But so in terms of talking, right? I mean, animals don't have vocal cords, right? They can't, right? But they do have ways of communicating, even with humans.
And we're thinking about other saints who have befriended animals
right.
and communicated with animals on a level that we can't really normally, but
right.
they did without words.
Right. St. Seraphim's bear couldn't like make human language, right? Speak Russian, right. But they communicated with it. Yeah. And that is a product of the enmity between humanity and the rest of creation is a product of the fall and of sin. And of death, really, ultimately, because animals have to fear humans because we're predatory now.
Okay.
And so when you have a saint who is drawn close to God, right? St. Seraphim, the bear was not afraid of St. Seraphim. And did not have to be hostile to him, right? And so we see lots of saints in various ways who are at peace with the animal creation and the rest of creation, right? Because that enmity caused by sin and death and violence, right, has been overcome in them by Christ.
Yeah. I mean, you've got, St. Gerasimos and his lion, St. Kevin and the bird that nested in his hand. He had to keep his hand out for a long time. Hey, it's in the life of St. Kevin of Glendalough, so it's right there. Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Yep.
So what? Yes. What is your best advice for moving in that direction towards a lack of enmity with animals and allowing God to perform miracles in your life?
One of the best pieces of advice I ever got was from the late Father Alexander Addy. who was a priest in Kentucky for a long time and then became the dean of St. Tikhon's Seminary for a while until he got cancer. He said, make the place you're in into paradise. And the great thing about that advice is it's so multivalent. You can apply it in so many different ways, right? But one of the most immediately applicable, I think, is really a dedication to beauty. Our American culture has us always casting our minds and our gaze outside of where we are. Like we're always looking at imagery of other people who live thousands of miles away from us, and so I often you get like, you can kind of notice this. Like I live in a neighborhood with lots of houses, and you can walk around and you can tell the ones where the people kind of live inside the house, and just like mow the lawn. And then people that are working on the space around their house to try to turn it into a little paradise in one way or another, to their degree of their ability. And I think that like putting everything in order and dedicating it to beauty, even small beauty, right? Like that we don't have to be the best at every single thing that we do. We can still dedicate ourselves to doing it as best as we can. Like people like, well, I'll never be able to sing like Taylor Swift, who is actually from not very far away from where I live. She's from the town of Reading, which Reading is a perfectly nice city, but it's like not a glamorous place to be from, but she's from Reading, Pennsylvania. But nonetheless, you can still sing with your family, and music can be part of that paradisaical way of living in your home. Like there's all these ways of doing it. It's about shaping the space. I always love noticing the way that monasteries are shaped. And one thing I've noticed is that women's monasteries tend to be much more aesthetically interesting in a lot of ways than men's monasteries. I mean, there are some excellent male monastic gardeners. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I went to Athos. I saw some amazing stuff there. But frankly, women's monasteries are just much sort of nicer to walk around in. And it's funny because, I mean, these are people that all have the same vocation, but it manifests in different ways according to the personality that are people that are there. They're turning their place into paradise. It's why you want to just stroll around and pray, because they made it that way, So those are the things that I would say about that. But also, that a significant piece of it being about trying to heal the hurts of the people in your home and those around you, because that's what paradise is supposed to be as well. It's supposed to be healing.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Christ is risen.
Indeed, truly, verily, he is risen.
We say in truth, he is risen. In
truth. Nice. I've never been to a parish that does that.
Oh, come out to California.
Even though it's a foreign country, as far as I'm concerned, I do have a passport.
I don't know if I can go back. I've got warrants.
Oh, come out. Come visit St. Xenia's monastery. It's a little paradise.
There you go. All right. Thank you very much for calling, Hannah. All right. We have one final caller, and it's Olivia from Texas.
The pressure's on. Closing us
better
out.
Be good, Olivia.
Oh, can you hear me?
We hear you. Welcome to the Lord of Spirits podcast. Hopefully we didn't intimidate you with all of that pressure.
No. I can't tell when I'm just listening or when you can actually hear me, when it goes from one to the other. But thank you for having me on and for taking my question. I'm actually a very recently chrismated, as of yesterday, Orthodox Christian.
Oh, wow.
Awesome. So you're still like glowing with it.
Yes, there's actually a beam of light following me around everywhere I go.
Did you take the name Mid-Pentecost?
I didn't.
Okay, good. That would not be a good one.
Heavily considered, but did not go with that. I went with Tatiana of Rome, actually.
Nice. A fine choice.
But my question is actually not really along those lines. It's just something that I've been very curious about. My fiance comes from a Catholic background, and I am from a Protestant background. And just in all of our discussions and maybe quarrels here and there, one of the things that was kind of brought up in evidence of the truth of the Catholic Church in all these discussions was some examples of Eucharistic miracles. And there's a lot of accounts of them happening all over the world, and there's video footage, and sometimes they even get specimens tested in labs, and they find that it's real human flesh or blood, or, it all lines up. And I just, don't know how to compute that. I don't know what to make of it. And I don't know if there's an answer to this question, but I was just curious if anyone in the Orthodox realm has a stance on that, or has any insight to share on how to kind of process what's going on there.
Yeah. Right. I know that people often treat miracles this way. Like, look, we've got a miracle. That means everything else we do is right. Or we're the real deal. So, that ought to work if one can show that miracles only happen within that one group. Even if you accept that that's a proof of the rightness of that group, right? Setting that question aside, is that what miracles are for? But the reality is that there are miracles observed in a lot of places. I like you, I have a Protestant background. I grew up the son of missionaries, and I talked with a lot of other missionary kids, and a number of them told me tales from the mission field, which, assuming they weren't all lying to me, were definitely miraculous stuff.
Yeah.
I've experienced some things in my life as well. I've watched streaming icons. I stood there and watched an icon stream so much myrrh that it began to just flow onto the floor.
Wow.
I watched it actually literally form on the glass of the case. Not that it oozed onto the glass, it formed in the middle of the glass.
Wow.
I venerated the hand of St. Mary Magdalene, which they have at Simeno Petra Monastery in Athos, which is not only incorrupt, still has a flesh on it, still flexible, but is warm, right?
Yeah.
And these are all Orthodox contexts. So should I say, well, let me line up my miracles against your miracles, and that's my apologetic? But what about the Protestants that are having miracles? What about the Hindus who are having miracles? What about the Muslims that are having, it goes on and on.
Yeah.
So I think it's a really bad apologetic. I would not take it as being proof of anything. If it is a miraculous thing, there's a couple of possibilities. One is that it's from the evil one and it's designed to harm people. Another is that it's from God and it's designed to call people to repentance. The real test is whether people are repenting.
Yeah.
I think we've said on this show before, if I recall, or maybe it was somebody else, somewhere else, I don't recall, but there are good things that happen outside of the boundaries of our churches,
yes.
right? Which seems like an obvious thing to say, but I like to give an example that I think is a little bit shocking. Father Stephen mentioned Jonah earlier, and the repentance of the people of Nineveh. So they really repented. It's mentioned in the New Testament that they did, right? That they're going to rise up as witnesses against unrepentant people. Well, here's the funny thing. There's no indication that Nineveh ever turned to worshiping Yahweh. So these are pagans. But they did repent. They did successfully repent so that God did not smash their city. So, repentance is a miraculous thing. I think as an apologetic, it's just I understand why people like to use it, because wow, that's really great. That's amazing. But when you start to ask questions of that as an apologetic, it really starts to fall apart. I would just simply say that it's evidence that God is working in a lot of different contexts, and if someone's repenting, that is repenting. If something is an icon of the Mother of God, I don't care which chapel it's hanging in, it is an icon of the Mother of God. It is what it is. So apologetics need to be done on other grounds.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that that's a good ground. I don't know, Father, do you have anything you want to add?
Here comes bad cop.
All right.
I'm about to get a bunch of people mad at me again.
That's great. See what you did, Olivia.
I don't mind.
I'm just trying to bring the best question of the night, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, there you go.
So Christ said concerning people who wanted miracles to prove that something was true, woe to the generation that asks for a sign.
There you go.
Woe is kind of under-translated in modern English. That's accursed.
Mm.
Actually, the closest thing to woe is damned.
Mm-hmm.
Condemned. Okay. And one of the big differences between the Orthodox miracles that Father Andrew just mentioned and some other miracles that people present is, I don't know of anyone Orthodox who's ever trotted out the hand of St. Mary Magdalene to say, look, this is proof that Orthodoxy is true.
Yeah, that's not what the Simone Petra monks are doing with it.
And I'd be willing to bet money, and I'm saying this as a Dutchman, I'd be willing to bet money that if they tried that, it would decay. And it would no longer be warm.
Yeah.
We have to remember what Christ taught us about miracle workers. Right? But Lord, we cast out demons in your name and work miracles and healings. Begone, I never knew you. Right? The surest sign that a miracle is false is that someone is presenting it to you as proof of something, of their own authority. They want you to follow them. They want you to believe them because of it. Beware. This is why I'm going to get people mad at me. If you look at when the Eucharistic miracles, in particular in the Roman Catholic Church, started, it's the 16th century.
Ah.
When Protestants showed up.
That is interesting.
All of a sudden these start happening to prove to the Protestants that they're wrong. They especially start in France. There are a number of these kinds of miracles in the West, Eucharistic miracles being a prime example, the stigmata being another one, that when they have occurred in the East, they have been seen as signs of God's judgment and wrath. Not as positives.
Wow.
So I'm thinking, for example, of the story of a certain Romanian priest who was a government plant from the secret police. He was not a Christian. They planted him as a priest. He was celebrating the liturgy and looked at the paten and saw bloody human flesh. This was a sign of God's judgment on him. He ended up actually becoming a Christian and ended up being a martyr when he turned on his handlers during the communist period.
Wow.
So for us, some of these signs are signs of the exact opposite thing that they're sometimes presented as in the West. I know this is going to get a bunch of Catholic listeners mad at me, but I'm sorry, this is the truth. From an Orthodox perspective, when those things have happened in the East, we viewed them as signs of God's wrath and judgment, not as positive miracles. And we do not believe in presenting miracles as proof of the truth of something or the authority of someone. And that goes right back to the Scriptures. No one ever does that in the Scriptures, least of all Christ.
Yeah, he often tells people, don't tell anybody about this, or everybody out of the room. I mean, that happens a lot. It's not everybody gather around, I'm going to do something big.
Yeah. So that kind of apologetic use is a sign of a very flawed mindset. I'm not saying this about the person who's presenting them to you, right?
No.
I don't know him in particular, right? And I don't know, and I'm sure he's not getting this from his own mind, right? He's hearing this from other people, right?
Right.
And the people he's heard it from, this may have been in the context of like youth ministry and like, hey, see, our faith is real. Look at this report of this miracle and that miracle. They're not even using it in that kind of apologetic way, right?
Right.
They're using it kind of an internal way, right? You know, to try and help keep kids in the faith and, you know, that kind of thing, right? So, I mean, you can come by this mistaken view honestly, right? Without, but it is a deeply mistaken way of looking at these things ultimately.
Right.
Send your hate mail to Father Andrew at ancientfaith.com.
And they will. All right. Does that help, Olivia?
It does. I think that's going to help me a lot in just kind of wrapping my mind around the concept. And I mean, I already thought about other miracles in that way, that kind of open way, like God can work wherever he wants to work. It doesn't have to be within the confines of one church. But for some reason, this specific kind, just because I guess of how it had been used, or, you know, there will be articles written or videos shared on the internet. I don't know why it just kind of perked my interest and I couldn't really figure out what was going on there. So I think this does help a lot in just kind of wrapping my mind around all of it as a concept and basing it back in Scripture for sure. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for calling.
Yeah, when you say you had a vision of the Theotokos, I'm ready to believe you. When you tell me as soon as she appeared, she said, I am the Immaculate Conception, I'm dubious. That's all I'm saying.
Bam. All right. Well, I thought that was a very we're done. Good Q&A episode. We're going to do one more Q&A. Our next episode is going to be a Q&A, but it's going to be a pre-recorded one with SpeakPipe voicemails. So we've got a bunch of them lined up. And we're going to play that for you next. And then, you know, in June, we're going to be talking about the Antichrist and
the son of Belial,
the mark of the lawless one, the mark of the beast, all that kind of fun stuff.
Yeah.
Should be a hot summer.
Break out your old VHS tapes from Jack Van Impe.
Oh yeah, I'm going to get out my Clarence.
Get ready to record over them.
All right. Well, that is our show for tonight. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. If you didn't get through to us live this time, we would still like to hear from you. You can email us at lordofspirits@ancientfaith.com. You can message us at our Facebook page, or you can leave us a voicemail at speakpipe.com/lordofspirits.
And join us for our live broadcast, except for the next one, on the 2nd and 4th Thursdays of the month at 7 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. Though you can come live and watch, I think, the stream or the premiere or whatever the thing is.
I think so.
You'll be live. We won't be. Yeah. We'll be memorized.
Yeah. If you're on Facebook, you can follow our page, join our discussion group, leave reviews and ratings everywhere, but most importantly, share this show with a friend who's going to benefit from it.
And finally, be sure to go to ancientfaith.com/support and help make sure we and lots of other AFR podcasters stay on the air, and email Father Andrew to join the class action lawsuit against me for my hurtful words.
Thank you. Good night. God bless you. And Christ is risen.
You've been listening to The Lord of Spirits with Orthodox Christian priests, Father Andrew Stephen Damick and Father Stephen DeYoung, a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio. And I beheld, and I heard the voice of many angels round about the throne, and the beasts, and the elders, and the number of them was 10,000 times 10,000, and thousands of thousands, saying with a loud voice, Worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power, and riches, and wisdom, and strength, and honor, and glory, and blessing. Revelation chapter 5, verses 11 through 12.
Welcome to another